She crossed 3,000 miles of railroad track to marry a man she had never met. She stepped down off the morning train in her dust-covered navy gown, lifted her chin, and looked into the eyes of the tall stranger waiting on the platform. "You are not Elias." "No, ma'am. Elias was my brother." The word was struck her like a small slap. Her future husband was already 9 days in the ground, buried on a hill she had never seen in a mountain valley, where three rough men she did not know were the only thing standing between her and the snow. She had no money for return passage. She had burned every bridge in Boston. She had nowhere left in this world to go, and the worst was still coming. Because under the floorboards of that dead man's bedroom, a secret was waiting for her, a secret written in pencil by a hand now stilled, forever naming the man who had murdered him. This is the story of Cordelia Merriweather, the woman from Boston who walked into Ashcombe Hollow with nothing but a velvet pouch of her grandmother's pearls and changed the lives of three mountain brothers forever. Sit back, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and let me tell you how it all began on a September morning in 1879 on the wooden platform of the Stonewater Bend Depot in the high country of Colorado. The telegram in Wyatt Ashcombe's coat pocket had been read so many times the paper was beginning to come apart along the creases. He stood on the wooden platform of the Stonewater Bend Depot with his back straight as a fence post and one large hand resting on the worn grip of the Colt at his hip, and he watched the eastern horizon where the smoke of the morning train was just beginning to rise above the cottonwoods. The September sun was already hot on the back of his neck. The dust on the platform smelled of horses and coal and the dry grass of Colorado in the last week before the first frost. 6 days ago, he had buried his youngest brother in the soft earth on the hill behind the cabin. He had dug the grave himself because he could not bear the thought of any other man's shovel breaking that ground. He had laid Elias down in his Sunday shirt with a piece of pine wood for a marker because there had been no time and no money for proper stone. He had said a few words that came out wrong and a few more that did not come at all, and then he had walked back to the cabin in a silence so complete it felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath alongside him. Now this, now the telegram, now the woman. The paper crinkled against his ribs as he shifted his weight. He had read the words enough times to know them by heart, but he reached for them again anyway because his hands needed something to do. Arriving Thursday morning train. "Stop your bride, stop. Cordelia Merriweather. Stop. Bless us both, stop." The clerk in Boston had typed those words exactly as his brother Elias had handed them across the counter 6 weeks ago in a city Wyatt had never seen and never wanted to see. The clerk had no way of knowing that the man who paid for the wire was already a dead man walking. Elias had paid his coin and walked back out into the world believing he had 3 more months to make a home ready for the woman who would share it with him. He had been wrong about that the way young men are often wrong, and the mountain had taken him for it. Wyatt folded the telegram once and slid it back into his pocket and looked down the tracks again. The smoke was closer now. He could hear the faint rumble of the engine through the soles of his boots. A voice came from behind him, slow and dry as old leather. "You look like a man waiting on his own hanging, Wyatt." He did not turn. "Morning, Hollis." Sheriff Hollis Drennan stepped up alongside him, working a fresh chew into the corner of his cheek. The sheriff was a thin, silver-bearded man in his late 50s who had been keeping the peace in Stonewater Bend since the war ended, and there was very little in the territory of Colorado that escaped his notice. He spat once into the dirt beside the platform and squinted toward the horizon. "Whole town's talking about it," Drennan said. "Says Elias Ashcombe sent for a wife from back east. Says she's coming in on the morning train. Says you're the one who has to stand here and tell her her husband is in the ground. Whole town can mind its own business. Whole town hasn't done that since the day God made dirt, son. You ought to know that by now." Wyatt did not answer. The smoke was very close now. He could see the shape of the locomotive against the pale sky, and he could feel the tightness in his chest that had been there for 6 days finally squeezed down into something hard and small and impossible to swallow. He had spent the ride down from Ashcombe Hollow rehearsing what he would say to her. He had spent the night before that doing the same thing. He had a speech all worked out in his head, gentle but firm words that would make her understand the situation without making her cry. He was going to tell her that there had been a mistake. He was going to put her on the next train heading east. He was going to send her back to whatever life she had come from and let his own life go back to the slow, grinding silence it had been before any of this had ever started. That was the plan. "You sure you don't want me to do the talking, Wyatt?" Drennan said quietly. "I've delivered bad news to widows before. It's a thing a sheriff learns. She isn't a widow. She never even got to be a wife." "Even so." Wyatt shook his head once. "He was my brother. It ought to come from me. An Ashcombe man keeps his word." The whistle of the train cut across the valley, then long and lonesome and sharp enough to startle a flock of crows out of the cottonwoods, and the engine came rolling into the station with its bell ringing and its brakes shrieking iron against iron, and Wyatt Ashcombe felt his rehearsed speech evaporate out of his head like steam off a hot kettle. The train stopped. Doors opened. Passengers began to step down onto the platform. A traveling salesman with a brown leather case. Two miners with packs slung across their shoulders. An older couple holding each other by the elbow as if they were each afraid the other might fall. And then her. She came down the metal steps without waiting for the conductor's hand. She carried her own small trunk by the leather strap, and she set her boots on the platform with a quiet certainty that did not match the way Elias had described her in his letters at all. Elias had written about a practical woman, a sensible woman, a woman who would not be afraid of hard work. Elias had not written about the way the morning sun would catch her hair, as if it had been waiting all night to do exactly that. He had not written about the cornflower color of her eyes. He had not written about the proud lift of her chin or the way she carried herself like a woman who had once known better days and was determined not to flinch at the loss of them. She was small, 5'3" at the most, slender as a willow switch, dressed in a navy blue traveling gown that had clearly been chosen with care, but had picked up the dust of 3,000 miles of railroad track. There was a small cameo brooch at her throat and a few honey-colored curls escaping them from beneath her bonnet, and there was a faint, thin scar above her left eyebrow that Wyatt's eye caught and filed away without quite knowing why. She set her trunk down. She looked at the crowd. Her eyes moved across face after face, searching, searching, and then they found him. He saw the exact moment she understood. Her face did not crumble. Her eyes did not fill. She did not sway or reach for support or do any of the things he had been bracing himself for. She simply went very still, the way a deer goes still in the half-second before it decides whether to run or hold its ground, and then she walked toward him across the platform with her boots clicking quietly on the boards. The crowd seemed to move out of her way without quite knowing it was doing so. When she stopped in front of him, she was close enough that he could smell the lavender she had pressed into her gloves and the faint trace of train smoke in the wool of her gown. "You are not Elias." Her voice was low and even. There was no waver in it. There was no question in it either, because she was not asking, she was confirming a thing she had already understood. "No, ma'am." His own voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "I am Wyatt Ashcombe. Elias was my brother." The word "was" struck her like a small slap. He saw her absorb it. He saw her hands tighten just slightly on the cuffs of her gloves. He saw her draw in one careful breath and let it out again, and when she spoke, her voice was even quieter than before, almost gentle, the way you might speak to a frightened animal you did not want to spook. "How long?" "9 days, ma'am. There was a mining accident." "Did he suffer?" "No, ma'am. It was quick." She nodded once, just once. Then she set her trunk down on the platform between them with the same careful precision a woman might use to set down a piece of fine china, and she folded her gloved hands in front of her at her waist, and she lifted her eyes to his and asked the question he had not been ready for. "When is the next train east?" "Tomorrow morning, ma'am. Same time as this one." "Tomorrow." She turned her head and looked past him at the mountains that rose blue and enormous beyond the edge of town, and Wyatt watched her looking and saw something move in her face that he could not quite read. It was not fear. It was not grief. It was something older and harder and closer to the bone than either of those things. And for one strange moment, he had the sense that he was looking not at a girl from Boston who had just been told her future was dead, but at a woman who had been told that exact same news once before in a different city by a different man and had survived it. She turned her clear blue eyes back to him. "Mr. Ashcombe." "Wyatt, just Wyatt is fine." "Mr. Ashcombe." She did not give him the gentleness of the first name. "Your brother and I had an agreement made in writing, witnessed by an agency and paid for in advance. 6 months of room and board on his land with the option for either party to dissolve the arrangement after that period if it proved unsuitable. I have a copy of that contract in my trunk. I sold everything I owned in Boston to come here. I burned every bridge that was left to me. I have no money for return passage. I have no family who will take me back. I have no home east of these tracks." Her chin lifted another quarter inch. "Your brother is dead. I am sorry for that more than I can tell you. But the contract he signed did not die with him. It transferred to whoever inherited his land, his debts, and his obligations. I assume that man is you." Behind Wyatt, Sheriff Drennan had made a small sound in his throat that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh, quickly choked off. Wyatt did not turn to look. He could not have turned to look if the mountain itself had ordered him to. He was caught by those steady blue eyes, the way a man is caught when he steps in a snare he never saw set, and every single word of the speech he had prepared was now scattered somewhere down on the tracks beneath the cooling wheels of the train. He found his voice with difficulty. "Ma'am, I do not think you understand the kind of place I am asking you to consider. Ashcombe Hollow is 3 miles up the mountain. The cabin has 2 rooms. There is no town within walking distance. The winters here will kill a person who is not ready for them. And there is not just me. There are my brothers, Beckett and Tobias. 3 men in a cabin and 1 woman is not a situation that any decent person would advise." "Are you a decent person, Mr. Ashcombe?" "I try to be." "Then I will trust your trying." She drew in another careful breath. "Your brother promised me a home. He did not promise me ease. He did not promise me comfort. He promised me a place where I would not be turned out into the snow when I had nowhere else to go. I am asking you to honor that promise. 6 months. After that, if I have proven a burden, you may put me on the eastbound train yourself, and I will not say a word against you. But I am not getting back on that train tomorrow. I am not going back to Boston. I would rather take my chances on your mountain with 3 strangers I do not know than go back to the city where I do." She let the words sit between them on the empty platform. The train hissed steam behind her. The crowd had drifted away by degrees, and now there was almost no one left, just the 2 of them, and Sheriff Drennan a respectful pace behind, and the dust of the high country settling slowly down out of the air. Wyatt looked at this small woman in her dust-covered navy gown, this woman who should have been weeping into a handkerchief and who instead was negotiating her own survival like a banker closing on a loan, and he understood with a sinking certainty that he had already lost the argument. He had lost it the moment she stepped down off that train. He just had not been wise enough to know it yet. He drew in a long breath. He let it out. He looked her in the eyes and he gave her the only answer his conscience would allow him to give. "An Ashcombe man keeps his word, ma'am. My brother gave you his. That makes it mine now." He bent and lifted her trunk by its leather strap and was nearly pulled off balance by the weight of it. "You are coming home with me." Something moved across her face then. It was not a smile. It was something quieter than a smile and braver and more tired, and it was the first true thing he had seen her do since she stepped off the train. "Thank you, Mr. Ashcombe." "Wyatt." "Wyatt, then." She picked up her gloves where they had loosened from her fingers and slid them back into place. And my given name is Cordelia. My family called me Della. You may use whichever you prefer." Sheriff Drennan touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to Stonewater Bend." He looked at Wyatt and his old eyes were unreadable. "I will see you, Wyatt, sooner than you think I expect." Wyatt wondered later what exactly Drennan had meant by that. At the time, he was too busy trying to balance a woman's traveling trunk on the saddle of a horse that had never been asked to carry such a thing before. And he did not think about the sheriff's words again until much later that same day when Drennan came riding up the mountain road with a folded paper in his hand and trouble written across his weathered face. But that was later. For now, there was only the long ride home. He had thought about hiring a wagon from Mr. Bramwell at the livery, but a wagon would have cost coin he did not have. So instead, he loaded the trunk behind the saddle and helped Della up to sit side saddle in front of him with her gown carefully arranged. She held herself stiff at first, as far from his chest as the saddle would allow, and he tried to give her every inch of distance the leather would permit. The horse, a steady chestnut gelding named Hickory that Wyatt had broken to saddle himself 5 winters ago, did not seem to mind the extra weight. They rode out of Stonewater Bend at a slow walk, while Della looked around her at the dusty main street with its general store and its livery and its single saloon and its small white church at the far end, and she did not say a single word. The road climbed almost from the moment they left town. Within a mile, they were in the pines, and the air went from the dry heat of the valley to something cooler and greener, and full of the smell of resin and turned earth. A creek ran beside the road for a while, fast and clear over white stones, and Wyatt pointed it out without quite knowing why he was bothering. "That is Whisper Creek. It runs down out of the hollow. We use it for water. It is cold enough to crack your teeth even in August." "It is beautiful." "It is a creek, ma'am. There are 1,000 of them in these mountains." "It is still beautiful." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They climbed higher. The pines gave way in places to aspens whose leaves were just beginning to turn the first pale gold of the season, and the road wound through them like a thread through cloth. He pointed out Ashcombe Peak when it came into view, the great flat-shouldered mountain at the head of the hollow that the family had been named for almost 40 years now, ever since his grandfather had come west from Tennessee and laid his claim. He told her that the family had run cattle on the lower slopes since the war, and that they had a small mining claim higher up that his brother Elias had been working on the day he died. His voice caught a little on his brother's name. He pretended it had not. "How many head of cattle?" she asked. 40, maybe 35 now. We lost some over the winter." "How many horses?" 3 saddle horses and 1 draft horse for heavy work, and 6 chickens that mostly live wild under the porch and lay where they please. She nodded thoughtfully, and he had the strange sense that she was taking inventory in her head, the same way a banker takes inventory of a debtor's assets. "You have done this before," he said. "My uncle had a farm outside Concord. I spent every summer there from the time I was 9 until I was 16. I learned to milk a cow and chase chickens and mend a fence before I learned to play the piano, much to my mother's distress." A small, dry note entered her voice. "I am not the woman your brother thought he was getting, Wyatt. I am not a fine lady from the city. I just happen to dress like one." He did not know what to do with that information either. He filed it away with the scar on her eyebrow and her honey-colored hair and her too proud chin, and he kept Hickory climbing the road. When they came over the last rise and the hollow opened out below them, he stopped the horse on instinct because he wanted her to see it, the way he had always seen it all at once, the whole valley spread out under the mountain like a hand that was holding something fragile. "That is Ashcombe Hollow." She looked. He saw her see it. He saw her notice the sagging roof of the cabin where 2 of the cedar shakes had blown loose in the August storms and never been replaced. He saw her notice the barn door hanging crooked on its top hinge. He saw her notice the corral fence on the north side where the rails had rotted at the posts and never been mended. He saw her notice the wild chickens scattered across the dooryard, in the dust, in the silence, in the general look of a place where a family of men had been losing a slow, steady war against entropy for too many years to count. He braced himself for the disappointment. She said the fence on the north side will need to come up first, new posts before the ground freezes. And those cedar shakes ought to be replaced before the snow comes, or you will have water in your cabin all winter. He stared at the side of her face. Yes, ma'am, they will. Then we had better get started. She glanced at him, and there was the faintest, dry humor in the corner of her mouth. After I have had a moment to wash my face, 3 days on a train will leave a woman feeling she has been dragged through every coal yard between Boston and Denver. He almost smiled then. He did not, because he had not allowed himself to smile in 9 days, and he was not sure he remembered how. But it was a near thing. He clucked to the horse, and they started down into the hollow. Beckett was the first one to see them. He was standing on the porch with his rifle across his shoulder, the way he always stood when he was waiting on something he did not trust, and the rifle did not come down when he saw them coming. Beckett was 29 years old and built almost exactly like Wyatt himself, near enough to be taken for a twin from a distance, with the same chestnut brown hair and the same whiskey-colored eyes, and the same set of shoulders that had been broken in by the same hard work. Where Wyatt was steady, though, Beckett was a banked fire. Where Wyatt held his temper, Beckett kept his on a hair trigger. He was the best shot of the three brothers and the worst diplomat by a wide margin, and the look on his face as Hickory came walking into the dooryard could have curdled fresh milk. Tobias, who at 27 was now the youngest of the three brothers still living, was over by the rain barrel on the side of the cabin. He had been mending a leak in the wooden gutter, and he froze with the hammer still raised in his hand when he saw Della. His mouth came open. A flush climbed his neck and ears so fast it was almost comical. Tobias had the same ashcombe build as his brothers, but his hair was a darker shade of blonde with sun streaks that the other two did not have, and his eyes were a softer, warmer amber, and at this particular moment, those eyes were staring at the woman on the front of his brother's saddle, as if she were a vision that had ridden up out of one of his own books. Wyatt reined Hickory to a stop in front of the porch. He swung down first, and then he reached up to help Della from the saddle, and she let him take her by the waist and lower her to the ground. She was lighter than he had expected. He cleared his throat. Beckett, Tobias, this is Miss Cordelia Merriweather of Boston. She is the woman Elias sent for. The silence that followed was the longest silence he had ever stood inside. Beckett's rifle came slowly down from his shoulder. His jaw worked once. His amber gaze flicked from Della to Wyatt and back to Della, and his voice when it came was flat and cold and entirely without welcome. You do not belong here, ma'am. It was the kind of greeting that would have broken most women in two. Wyatt felt his hand tighten unconsciously on the cuff of Della's sleeve, ready to step in front of her if he needed to. But Della only looked up at Beckett Ashcombe with those steady blue eyes, and she answered him in a voice as calm as a windless pond. Perhaps not yet, Mr. Ashcombe, but I do not belong anywhere else either. So we will simply have to learn to make room for one another. Will we not? Beckett blinked. Tobias over by the rain barrel dropped his hammer. It made a small, clear sound on the wooden porch boards, and then there was no sound at all for what felt like a long time, and then Tobias laughed. It was a small, startled laugh, half embarrassed and half delighted, and it cracked the silence open like an egg. Beckett shot his younger brother a look that could have peeled bark off a pine tree. Tobias only grinned and ducked his head and bent to pick up his hammer. Della turned to Wyatt as if none of this had happened. May I see the cabin? He led her up the porch steps. The boards groaned under their weight. He opened the door and stood aside and let her step inside ahead of him. And as she crossed the threshold, he felt a kind of shame settle on his shoulders that he had not felt in years. He saw the cabin then through her eyes, and what he saw was not good. The plank floor was covered in a film of dust. The table held a stack of unwashed tin plates and 3 coffee cups with rings of old grounds dried in their bottoms. A bachelor's heap of wool socks lay tossed in the corner by the stove. The single window was so streaked with grime that it let in only a kind of gray, reluctant light. There was a smell in the room that he had stopped noticing months ago, and that he was now acutely aware of the smell of four men and no soap and a winter's worth of wood smoke trapped in the rafters. He braced himself for her face to fall. She walked once around the inside of the cabin with her hands clasped at her waist. She looked at the stove. She looked at the table. She looked at the rough-hewn shelves above the dry sink. She walked to the door of the small back room that had been Elias's, and she stopped there and rested her gloved hand on the door frame. This was his. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am. May I? It is yours now. Go on. She pushed the door open. He did not follow her in. He stood in the main room of the cabin with his hat in his hand, and he heard her footsteps on the floorboards inside, slow and careful, and then he heard them stop. He heard nothing for a long moment. Then he heard the small, soft sound a woman makes when she has been holding herself together for a very long time, and a single thing gets through the wall. He looked away. He gave her the privacy of the wall between them. He set his hat on the table and went outside to see to the horse. Inside the small room, Della stood very still beside the narrow rope-strung bed that had belonged to a man she had never met. There was a wooden chair by the bed and a small table with a tin cup on it and a Bible that was bookmarked halfway through Psalms. There was a single shirt hanging on a peg behind the door, blue cotton, washed soft by many seasons. And on the pillow set neatly in the center, as if it were waiting for her, was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up with hands that had begun to tremble for the first time all morning. It was her own letter, the last letter she had written to Elias from Boston 3 weeks before she boarded the train. He had read it, he had folded it, he had set it on his pillow as if to keep it close, and the night he had walked up the mountain to Dynamite mining shaft, he had not taken it with him because he had still been planning to come back to it. Beneath the letter, on the small bedside table, was a folded sheet of butcher paper. She lifted it and unfolded it carefully. It was a sketch in black charcoal made by a hand that was more earnest and skilled of a 3-story cabin with a stone well and a flower garden and 2 wooden rocking chairs on the porch. A small note was written in pencil along the bottom margin in a careful hand. For Cordelia, the house I will build for us when there is time. Della Merriweather, who had crossed 3,000 miles without weeping, and who had been told her future was dead without weeping, and who had walked into the cabin of 3 strange mountain men without weeping, sat down on the edge of a dead man's bed and put her face into her hands and wept. She wept not for herself. She wept for the brother she had never gotten the chance to meet, who had folded her letter on his pillow and drawn pictures of houses he would never get to build. When she came back out into the main room some time later, her eyes were dry and her chin was up, and she had taken off her bonnet and rolled the lace cuffs of her gown back to her elbows. Wyatt. He was at the wash basin. He turned. I will need a broom, a bucket, a cake of lye soap if you have it, hot water from the stove, and as many clean rags as you can spare. If you have an extra set of bedding in any of your trunks, I would like to put it on the bed in there before nightfall. I will start in the kitchen and work my way out. Are you and your brothers willing to take your supper a little late tonight? I would like to clean before I cook. He looked at her. He looked at the woman who had stepped down off the morning train as a stranger and who was now standing in the middle of his cabin asking him for cleaning supplies as if she had lived there all her life, and a small piece of the hard knot in his chest, the knot that had been there since the day he carried his brother out of the mine, loosened by a 1/4 inch. Yes, ma'am. I can find you all of that. Thank you. By the time the sun was sliding down toward the western shoulder of Ashcombe Peak, the cabin had been transformed. The plank floor was no longer gray with dust. It was bare wood the color of new honey, and the streaks of grime were gone from the window, so that the late afternoon light came through in warm bars. The plates and cups had been scrubbed and stacked. The wool socks had been washed and hung on a line behind the stove. There was a small jar of late wildflowers that Tobias had shyly brought in from the meadow set in the middle of the table. The whole room smelled different. It smelled of lye and pinin and the venison stew bubbling on the Franklin stove in the corner, and it smelled like a place where a person could imagine living without losing their mind. The four of them sat down at the table together as the light went amber outside the windows. It was the first time in 9 days that the four chairs around the table had all been used. Beckett did not say much. He chewed in long silences, and he watched Della from beneath his brows, the way a man watches a mountain lion that has wandered into his camp and not yet decided what to do. Tobias talked too much, asking her questions about Boston and the train, and whether she had ever seen the ocean, and what books she had read on the journey, and Beckett had to kick him under the table twice to slow him down. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and ate slowly and said almost nothing at all, and watched the woman across from him with a careful, guarded attention that was the closest thing he had felt to peace in a very long time. When the meal was done, Della rose to clear the plates. Tobias rose to help her. Beckett pushed back his chair and went out to see to the horses without a word. Wyatt stayed at the table for a long moment, then he too rose. He went to the door of the small back room that had been Elias's, and he stood there with his hat in his hand, and he said quietly, "I left my brother's things in there. If you would prefer I move them." "No," she said. "Leave them. They are part of why I am here." He nodded. He turned to go. "Wyatt," he turned back. "There is something I want to show you, something I found while I was sweeping in there. Will you come in for a moment?" He stepped into the small room. It was the first time he had been inside it since the morning of his brother's funeral. The bed was made now with fresh ticking, and the floor was clean, and the shirt that had been hanging on the peg behind the door had been folded reverently and placed on the small table beside the Bible. The room felt like a room again. It did not feel like a tomb. Della knelt beside the bed and slid her hand under the corner of the rope frame. She drew out a small leather-bound book that she had set there a few hours earlier so that she could show it to him at the right moment. This was beneath one of the floorboards. The board near the head of the bed was loose. I felt it shift when I was sweeping, and I lifted it. This was inside of a tin tobacco box. She held it out to him. He took it. The leather of the cover was soft from much handling. He opened it carefully. It was a journal written in his brother's familiar slanted hand dating back almost a year. He flipped through the pages. There were entries about cattle and weather and a horse trade and a description of a black bear that had come down to the Salt Lick in May. There were entries about Della too, about the letter he had received from her in July, about the way her handwriting reminded him of a schoolteacher he had once admired. Wyatt's throat closed when he read those entries, and he had to look away from the page for a moment before he could go on. Then he reached the last entry. It was dated the night before Elias had died. Wyatt read it. He read it again. He sat down slowly on the wooden chair beside the bed because his knees had decided without consulting him that they did not want to hold him up any longer. The entry was short. It was written in pencil, and the handwriting was hurried, as if it had been put down quickly and in some agitation, but every word was clear. "Someone has been in the shaft. I went up this morning to check the charge I set yesterday, and the rope I left coiled by the entrance had been moved. 2 of the support timbers near the deep cut have been loosened. Not by accident. I can see the marks of a pry bar where someone worked them. There were boot prints by the lower entrance that are not mine and not Wyatt's. I think it is Crow. He has been sniffing around the claim for a year, and he knows I am close to the vein. I will not say anything to my brothers tonight because Wyatt will go off half-cocked, and Beckett will start a fight, and Tobias will lose sleep over it. I will tell them in the morning when we are at the table together, and we will decide what to do as a family. Lord help me, I think Vernon Crow means to have this mountain, even if it costs blood to take it." That was the end of the entry. There were no more pages written in his brother's hand after that one. Wyatt closed the journal very carefully. His hands were not trembling. He had not let them tremble in many years, and he was not going to begin now. But there was a coldness moving up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the September evening or the high mountain air, and there was a sound in his ears like a creek running fast under ice, And when he looked up at Della Merriweather, where she knelt beside the bed, she was watching him with those quiet blue eyes. And she said nothing at all because she had read the entry herself before she had called him in, and she had understood already that what he was holding in his hands was not a journal anymore. It was a confession written by a dead man naming his own murderer. Wyatt got to his feet. He did it slowly, the way an old man rises out of a deep chair. He looked down at the journal in his hand. He looked at the small, fresh bed where his brother had slept the last sleep he ever took under his own roof. He looked at the woman who had walked into all of this not 12 hours before and who had already picked up a floorboard and uncovered a secret no one in the family had known existed. Della, yes, you will not say a word about this to my brothers tonight. Not at the table, not in the yard, not where Beckett can hear you. Do you understand me? I understand. In the morning, when the sun is up and we have all eaten and there is light to think by, then we will tell them. Then we will decide what to do. Tonight you will say nothing. All right, Wyatt. He nodded once. He tucked the journal inside his vest against his ribs, in the same place where his brother's death telegram had been folded that morning, and the weight of it there felt like the weight of a thing that was going to change every plan he had made for the rest of his life. He turned to leave the small back room, and as he reached the door, he stopped, and without turning around, he said the only thing he could think of to say, "Thank you." She did not answer. She did not need to. He walked out into the main room of the cabin and across the plank floor and out onto the porch and into the yard, and he stood there for a long time looking up at the dark shape of Ashcombe Peak rising against the last of the western light. The first stars were beginning to show. A coyote called once from somewhere high on the mountain and was answered by a second one even higher up. And then there was only the sound of the wind in the pines and the small, ordinary sounds of his brothers settling in for the evening behind him. His brother had been murdered. His brother had not died in any accident the mountain had given him. His brother had been killed by a man with a name and a face, and that man was named Vernon Crow. And that man owned half the claims on the south slope of the range and was widely known in Stonewater Bend to have a habit of getting what he wanted. Wyatt closed his eyes for a long, slow moment. He thought of his brother in the shaft on the morning of his death, walking into a trap that someone had laid for him with a pry bar in the dark. He thought of how Elias would have been alone up there with no one to help him when the timbers came down. He thought of digging him out for 3 days with his bare hands, certain the whole time that he would be too late, knowing he was going to be too late, refusing to stop digging anyway. He opened his eyes. He was going to find Vernon Crow. He was going to find him, and he was going to make him answer for what he had done. And he was going to do it within the law if he could, and outside it if he had to. That was not a decision. It was a thing that had been settled inside him in the moment he read the last words his brother had ever written. But he was not going to do any of it tonight. He was going to walk back into the cabin, and he was going to act as if everything was ordinary, and he was going to let his brothers sleep one last night in a world where their youngest was just a tragedy and not a murder, because his brothers deserved that one more night, and so did the woman from Boston who was going to be drawn into the middle of this, whether any of them wanted it or not. He turned to go back to the cabin. He stopped. There was a horse coming up the road from the valley. He could hear the slow, steady clop of shod hooves on the packed dirt of the trail, and after a moment he could see the lantern swinging from the rider's hand against the deepening blue of the dusk. And after another moment he recognized the silhouette of the rider himself. It was Sheriff Hollis Drennan. The sheriff did not ride 3 miles up a mountain at the end of the day for a friendly call. He did not ride that far at all unless something was wrong. Wyatt walked out to meet him at the edge of the dooryard. Drennan reined his horse to a stop and looked down at him in the lantern light. There was a folded paper in the sheriff's left hand. "Wyatt." "Hollis, what brings you up at this hour?" The sheriff hesitated. He looked past Wyatt at the cabin where the warm yellow light of the kitchen lamp was now showing in the clean window. He looked back at Wyatt. "I am sorry to bring this to you on the same day your bride came in, but you ought to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." He held out the paper. "Vernon Crow was at my office at 4 this afternoon. He filed a claim against your brother's estate. He says Elias borrowed $300 from him in May for mining equipment, and that the loan came due last week, and that the debt now passes to you as the surviving heir. With interest, he is demanding $345. He says if you do not pay him in full within 3 weeks, he will move to take the mining claim itself in court as settlement. Wyatt took the paper. He did not need to open it. He could see his brother's name and Crow's signature in the failing light through the folds of the page. He looked up at the sheriff. Hollis? Yes. That night, the night Elias died, Drennan's old eyes were steady on his. There were two boys riding back from a hunt up by the elk meadow. They came past the lower switchback on the trail to your mine just before sundown. They told their father 2 days later, and their father told me yesterday. The sheriff drew a long breath. They saw a horse tied at the base of the trail, a roan with a white blaze. They knew the horse Wyatt. Everybody in this valley knows that horse. He let the words land. It belonged to Vernon Crow. Wyatt did not move. He did not speak. Above him, the first thin scatter of stars was hardening into the darker sky, and behind him, the warm yellow light of his cabin window glowed against the September dusk. And inside that cabin, there was a woman from Boston who had not asked for any of this, who had crossed 3,000 miles to find a husband already in his grave, and a journal under a floorboard, and a man's quiet promise that an ashcombe always keeps his word. Hollis, yes, son. Tell no one you came up here tonight, not even your deputy. Will you do that for me? I will. But Wyatt, yes. Whatever you were thinking of doing about Vernon Crow, do not do it tonight. Sleep on it. Sleep on it with that woman in your house and your brothers under your roof. There is more at stake here now than your grief. You hear me? Wyatt looked at the old sheriff for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly. I hear you, Hollis. Drennan touched the brim of his hat. He turned his horse. He started back down the road toward the valley with his lantern swinging at his hip, and the dark of the high country swallowed him before he had gone 50 yards. Wyatt stood alone in the dooryard with 2 folded papers in his pockets and a name in his head that he had not allowed himself to speak out loud yet. Vernon Crow. Behind him, the cabin door opened. He did not have to turn to know who it was. He felt her come out onto the porch and stop there at the edge of the boards, and he felt her looking at him back across the small distance. Wyatt? Yes, Della. Who was that on the road? He turned then. She was standing on the porch with the lamplight from the kitchen behind her so that her hair caught the gold of it like a halo, and her hands were folded at her waist, the way she had stood on the train platform that morning. Only this time she was standing on the porch of his cabin, and the navy gown was rolled to the elbows from a day of cleaning, and there was a smudge of dust on one cheek that no one had told her about. He looked at her, and he understood with a quiet certainty that the world he had walked out of that morning was no longer the world he was walking back into. Something had shifted under his feet between the dawn and the dusk, and there was no shifting it back. He climbed the porch steps slowly and stopped in front of her. Della. Yes, Wyatt. Tomorrow you and I are going to have a long conversation. There are things you need to know, things you have a right to know, since you have decided to tie yourself to this family for the next 6 months. Tonight I want you to go to bed. I want you to lock the door of that back room behind you, and I do not want you to open it for anyone but me until the sun is up. Do you understand me? I understand. And Della. Yes, he had meant to say something else. He had meant to say something practical. Instead, what came out of his mouth was the only thing he had truly meant to say all day, and he said it without quite knowing he was going to. You are home now, Della. For these 6 months at least you are home. I will see to it that nothing harms you under this roof. That is an Ashcombe man's word, and it is the only thing I have left in this world that is worth anything. She looked up at him. She did not smile, but something moved in her clear blue eyes that had not been there on the train platform that morning, and her chin lifted in that small, proud way of hers, and she answered him in a voice quieter than the wind in the pines. Thank you, Wyatt Ashcombe. She turned and went inside. He stood on the porch alone after the door had closed behind her, and he looked out over Ashcombe Hollow in the deep blue of the September dusk. The first hard stars were out now over the shoulder of the peak. Somewhere up the mountain, the coyote called again. The wind moved in the high pines with a sound like a long, slow breath being let out. He laid his hand against his vest, where his brother's journal pressed against his ribs alongside the morning's telegram and the sheriff's folded paper. 3 documents, 3 secrets. 1 mountain and 1 woman from Boston who had walked into the middle of all of it without ever once flinching, and who was now sleeping under his roof, and whose safety he had just promised on the only honor he had left. Winter was coming. He could feel it in the wind off the peak. He could feel it in the way the aspens had turned that day on the climb up from the valley. The first hard frost was a week away at the most, and after the frost would come the snow, and after the snow would come the long white silence of the months when no one rode in or out of Ashcombe Hollow without a fight against the drifts. He had 3 weeks to find $345 he did not have. He had a journal that named his brother's killer. He had a woman in his cabin who was not his wife and not his sister and not anything he had a name for yet. And somewhere down the mountain in the warm lit windows of a fine house in Stonewater Bend, Vernon Crow was sitting down to his own supper, believing that no one in the world knew what he had done. Wyatt Ashcombe stood alone on the porch of the cabin his grandfather had built, and he watched the last of the light go out of the western sky, and in the silence of his own heart, he made a quiet promise to a brother in a fresh grave on the hill behind the house. Whatever it took, whatever it cut down, an Ashcombe man keeps his word. He turned and went inside and closed the door against the coming night. The frost came in the night. Wyatt knew it before he opened his eyes, the way a man who has slept on a mountain his whole life knows things in his bones that no almanac will tell him. The air in the loft above the kitchen had that particular thin, clean edge to it, the edge that meant the meadow grass below the cabin would be silvered when the sun came up, and the water in the trough would have a skin of ice on it, the thickness of a fingernail. He lay still for a moment in the wool blankets and listened to the old cabin breathing around him. The kitchen lamp had been put out hours ago. He could hear Beckett snoring in the loft on the other side of the chimney, and he could hear Tobias turning over in his sleep and making the small, unhappy sounds Tobias had made in his sleep since he was 9 years old. From the back room came no sound at all. She was in there. He had not slept much. He had lain in the wool blankets with his brother's journal under his pillow and his brother's killer's name running circles in his head, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he had finally let himself fall into a thin gray rest that had not done him much good. Now the first pale wash of dawn was beginning at the edge of the loft window, and there was work to do, and Wyatt Ashcombe was a man who had always preferred work to thinking. He swung down out of the loft in his stocking feet and built up the fire in the Franklin stove the way he had built it 10,000 mornings before. He put the coffee on. He pulled on his boots by the door. He went out into the dooryard with the old enamel pail to break the ice on the trough and bring in fresh water, and the morning hit him in the face the way mountain mornings do in the last week before October. Sharp enough to make a man's eyes water and clean enough to make him glad he was alive to feel it. When he came back in and with the pail, she was already up. She was standing in the dry sink in the gray, clean dress she had unpacked from her trunk the night before with her honey hair pinned up in a simple twist at the back of her neck, and she was rolling out a small batch of biscuit dough on a board she had floured with the last of the flour from the shelf. She had found the cast iron skillet he had not been able to find for 2 months. She had set out 4 tin plates. She did not look up when he came in, but she said in that quiet, even voice of hers, "I started the bread. I hope that is all right. I could not sleep, and the kitchen was here." "It is all right." He set the pail down. He hung his coat on the peg. He stood there for a long, awkward moment because he did not know what a man was supposed to say to a woman who had baked him bread before the sun came up on her first morning under his roof, and then he simply walked over to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot and set one of them down on the corner of her workboard where it would not be in the way of her hands. Black. I do not know how you take it. Black is fine. No sugar. I prefer it without. He nodded and went to drink his own. They worked around each other in the small kitchen as the dawn came up at the windows. He brought in another armful of firewood. She slid the biscuits into the oven of the stove. He cracked the ice off the eggs in the basket on the cold pantry shelf, and she took them from him without a word and broke them into a bowl with the easy practice motion of a woman who had broken eggs into bowls in a dozen kitchens before this one. The cabin filled slowly with the smell of baking bread and frying eggs and wood smoke and coffee, and somewhere above them in the loft, Beckett groaned and rolled over and muttered something unprintable about the hour, and Tobias began to climb down the loft ladder, rubbing his eyes. Tobias stopped halfway down the ladder when he saw the table. His amber eyes went round. "There are biscuits." "Yes, Toby," Della said without turning from the stove. "There are biscuits. Wash your face and sit down." Tobias washed his face faster than Wyatt had ever seen him wash his face in his life. Beckett came down the ladder a minute later, scowling and bare to the waist with his suspenders hanging down from his belt, and he stopped in the middle of the kitchen floor with the same stunned look Tobias had worn. His amber gaze moved from the table to Della at the stove and back to the table again, and Wyatt watched his middle brother try and fail to find a single word for what he was looking at. "I made coffee too, Mr. Ashcombe," Della said, still without turning. "It is on the back of the stove. There is sugar in the small tin if you want it." Beckett opened his mouth. He closed it. He went and got himself a cup of coffee. Wyatt sat down at the head of the table and watched his brothers sit down at the places they had been sitting in for years, and he watched a woman from Boston set a plate of fresh hot biscuits and fried eggs, and the last of the cured bacon down between them, as if she had been doing it for those same years. And a small thing turned over in his chest that he did not have a name for. He was going to think about that thing later when he had time. He was not going to think about it now. Now they ate. For a few minutes, the only sound in the cabin was the sound of 4 hungry people doing justice to a hot breakfast. Beckett ate 3 biscuits before he came up for air. Tobias made a small, reverent sound over his second egg. Wyatt drank his coffee black and slow and watched the gray morning brighten beyond the window. And when the plates were nearly clean, he set down his cup and looked at his brothers across the table. "Beckett, Tobias." They both looked up at his tone. "After we eat, I need the both of you in the back room with me. There is something Della found last night that you need to see. You will not like it. I do not like it, but it cannot wait any longer than the end of this meal." Beckett's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What kind of something?" "The kind that has to be looked at with the door closed. Finish your breakfast first. There is no good in talking about it on an empty stomach." Beckett looked at him for a long beat, then set his fork down carefully and pushed the rest of his biscuit aside. "I have lost my appetite, Wyatt." "Eat the biscuit, Beckett. You will need your strength for the rest of today." Beckett ate the biscuit. When the plates were cleared, the 4 of them went into the small back room together. Della stood by the doorway with her hands folded at her waist, and Wyatt sat down on the wooden chair beside the bed and drew the leather journal from inside his vest where he had carried it all night. He held it for a moment in both hands, and then he opened it to the last entry and turned it so that his brothers could see the writing. This was under a loose floorboard. Della found it last night while she was sweeping. Beckett took the journal. He read the entry standing. His face did not change while he was reading, but Wyatt watched the knuckles of the hand that held the book go slowly white. When Beckett was finished, he handed the book to Tobias without a word, and Tobias read it too, and Tobias's face did change. Tobias's face went the color of the biscuit dough Della had rolled out an hour earlier. He sat down hard on the edge of the rope-strung bed. "Crow," Tobias said. The word came out very small. "Crow," Watt said. Beckett's voice, when it came, was so low and so flat and so cold that for a moment Wyatt did not even recognize it as his brother's voice. "I will kill him." "Beckett." I will kill him today. I will saddle the roan and I will ride down to his house in Stonewater Bend, and I will put a bullet through his eye in his own front parlor, and I will not lose 1 hour of sleep over it for the rest of my life. Beckett, do not Beckett me, Wyatt. He killed Elias. He pried the timbers loose with a bar in the dark, and he walked away and let our brother walk into a tomb he had built for him with his own hands. He killed our brother Wyatt. I will not eat another meal in this cabin until Vernon Crow is in the ground. You will eat another meal in this cabin tonight, Beckett, and the meal after that, and the meal after that, because I am telling you to. Beckett came up off his feet so fast Wyatt thought for a half-second his brother was going to come at him over the chair. The two of them stood face to face in the small back room, with the morning light coming pale and gray through the single window, and Beckett's amber gaze was lit up the way it got when there was a fight he could not see his way past, and Wyatt held his ground because he had been holding ground against his middle brother since the two of them were boys, and he knew exactly how to do it. It was Della who broke the standoff. Mr. Ashcombe. Both brothers turned. Both brothers had been called Mr. Ashcombe by her in the last 12 hours, and neither one of them was sure which of them she meant. She was looking at Beckett. Mr. Ashcombe, I have not known your family for 1 full day. I have no right to speak in this room. But I am going to speak anyway because I think the man your brother is asking you to be this morning is a harder man to be than the one you are trying to be, and harder is not the same as wrong. Beckett's jaw worked. He did not answer. If you ride down to Stonewater Bend today and you put a bullet in Vernon Crow in his own parlor, you will hang for it. You know you will hang for it. The judge in this county is Crow's cousin. The deputy here is a young man who is afraid of his own shadow and who will do whatever the cousin tells him to do. They will find you guilty inside of 1 week, and they will hang you inside of 2. And your brother Elias will still be in the ground, and your brother Wyatt will lose another brother, and your brother Tobias will lose another brother, and the man who killed Elias will simply move into this hollow over your dead bodies and take what he came for. That is not justice, Mr. Ashcombe. That is exactly what Vernon Crow wants you to do. She let the words sit there. I am asking you as a guest in your house to give your brother Wyatt 1 week, just 1 week, to find a better way. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Beckett looked at her. He looked at the journal in Tobias's hands. He looked at the shirt on the peg behind the door that had belonged to a brother he was never going to see again. Then he sat back down on the wooden chair so heavily it creaked under his weight, and he put his face in his hands, and the breath that came out of him was the breath of a man who has been carrying a thing for too long without putting it down. 1 week, he said. The words came out muffled through his hands. You have 1 week, Wyatt. After that, I will not be held. 1 week, Wyatt said. Thank you, brother. It was the last word any of them spoke in the room for a while. The week that followed was a week Wyatt Ashcombe would remember for the rest of his life, not for any single thing that happened in it, but for the way the whole shape of his world shifted by a few small degrees while he was not watching. They worked. They worked the way mountain men work when there is more to be done than there is daylight to do it in. They walked the fence line of the upper pasture and replaced 4 rotted posts before noon. On the second day, the 3 brothers swinging axes and sledges while Della carried the new posts up from the cut pile with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her clear blue eyes bright with the cold air. They patched the cedar shakes on the cabin roof on the 3rd day. Wyatt and Beckett up on the slope of the roof while Tobias passed shakes up to them from below, and Della stood in the dooryard calling out the spots where the daylight was still showing through. They mended the barn door on the 4th day. They drove the cattle down off the higher meadow on the 5th day, all 4 of them riding because Della had said quietly that she could ride, and Wyatt had given her Tobias's smaller bay gelding and discovered that she rode better than his youngest brother did, which Tobias bore with the good humor of a man who had already decided to like her. By the end of that week, the cabin looked different. The hollow looked different. Even the air around the four of them felt different, as if some long, sour thing had been swept out of the rafters of the place, along with the dust Della had carried out by the bucketful on her first afternoon. And every one of those days in the back of Wyatt Ashcombe's head, the clock was ticking. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until Vernon Crow came to take the mining claim. 3 weeks to find $345 he did not have. 3 weeks to prove murder against a man who had laid the trap so carefully that the only witness was a journal entry no court in this county would ever admit as evidence. He thought about it in the loft at night. He thought about it on the seat of the wagon. He thought about it standing over the workbench in the barn with a hammer in his hand and his eyes looking at nothing. He thought about it until thinking about it made his head ache, and then he thought about it some more. On the morning of the 8th day, he made a decision. We are going up to the claim. Beckett and Tobias were in the kitchen with him at the table. Della was at the stove with her back to them, stirring oats in the pot. She did not turn around when he spoke, but Wyatt saw her shoulders go very still. All four of us, he said. Beckett set down his coffee. Wyatt. Hear me out. The vein Elias wrote about in the journal is real. He would not have written it down if it was not. He had been working in that shaft for a year, and he knew what was in the rock. If the vein is real and we can pull enough ore out of it in 2 weeks to cover Crow's debt, then we take Crow's leverage away from him before he can use it. We pay the debt in coin in front of witnesses, and the mining claim stays with his family. After that, we deal with what he did to Elias. But first, we take away his hand on our throat. Wyatt, that shaft killed our brother. I know it killed our brother. I dug him out of it with my own hands. I am not going up there blind. We are going to go in slow, and we are going to shore every timber before we work below it, and we are not going to use a single charge of powder while we are in there. Elias died because someone tampered with the supports in the dark. We will not be in the dark, and we will not work past anything we cannot see. Beckett looked at him for a long moment, and her. He jerked his chin toward Della without turning his head. What about her? She comes with us. Now Della did turn. The wooden spoon was still in her hand, and there was a small spot of oat porridge on her wrist that she had not noticed yet, and her clear blue eyes were on Wyatt's face with a question in them that she had not asked out loud. Wyatt, you said yesterday you wanted to be of use, Della. The mine camp has a cabin. There are records to keep and meals to cook and 100 small things that need a steady pair of hands. I am not going to ask you to set foot inside the shaft. I am going to ask you to run the camp while we work the rock. Will you do it? She looked at him for a long beat. Yes. Good. We leave at first light tomorrow. Pack for a week. They left Ashcombe Hollow before sunup the next morning, with the pack horse loaded down with food and tools and bedding, and a coil of new rope Wyatt had bought on credit at the general store in Stonewater Bend, and they climbed 2 miles up the steep trail through the pines to the high meadow where Elias had run his mine. The mine camp was exactly as Elias had left it on the morning he died. A small log cabin with a tin roof, a tool shed, a picket line for the horses, a black mouth in the side of the mountain where the shaft entrance was still propped open with the heavy timber Elias had set there himself. A coil of rope by the entrance that had been moved by a hand that was not Elias's and never put back. Wyatt stood in the dooryard of the cabin for a long moment, looking at all of it, and Della came up beside him quietly and slipped her gloved hand around the edge of his elbow without saying anything, and after a moment he covered her hand with his own. Are you all right? She said. I will be. You do not have to go in today, Wyatt. The shaft will still be there tomorrow. No, if I do not go in today, I will not go in at all, and then I will have failed him twice. He went in. Beckett went in with him. Tobias stayed at the entrance with a coil of rope and a lantern in orders to pull them out hand over hand if either of them shouted. Della stayed at the camp cabin to lay a fire in the stove and unpack the bedding and write in a small ledger book she had brought up the mountain with her, the kind of small ledger book a Boston woman knew how to keep without being asked. The shaft smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and the faint, sweet smell of pine pitch that the support timbers gave off in the still air. Wyatt walked it slow with his lantern held high and his other hand running along the rough wall of the cut as he went. 20 paces in the floor sloped down. 40 paces in the timbers Elias had set the year before came into view. 60 paces in Wyatt stopped because the air had changed. He held the lantern up to the wall. There, a vein of white quartz the width of his thumb threaded with a darker line that was not quartz running diagonally across the face of the cut from the floor to a point about shoulder high. It was the vein. It was the vein his brother had been chasing for a year and had finally found and had not had the chance to tell anyone about before he died. Beckett came up behind him. The two brothers stood in the lantern light, looking at the rock for a long, quiet moment. "It is real," Beckett said. "It is real." "Wyatt?" "Yes, brother. He found it. Before he died, he found it." "Yes, Beckett, he found it." And then Beckett Ashcombe, who had not cried at his brother's funeral, and had not cried at his brother's grave, and had not cried in the 9 days since they had laid Elias in the ground, set the lantern down on the floor of the shaft and put his forehead against the cold stone wall beside the vein of quartz and cried the silent way men cry when they have been holding it back for too long. And Wyatt set his own lantern down and put his hand on the back of his brother's neck and held it there until the worst of it had passed. When they came back out into the daylight, Della was standing at the entrance of the camp cabin with a tin cup of hot coffee in each hand. She held the cups out to them as they came up the slope, and she did not ask any questions about the redness around Beckett's eyes, and Beckett took his coffee from her and said quietly, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice that had no edge in it at all for the first time since she had stepped down off the train. That was the moment Wyatt understood that something had begun to change between his middle brother and the woman from Boston, although neither of them yet knew it. The next 4 days were the hardest days of work Wyatt had ever asked of himself and the strangest. He and Beckett went into the shaft at first light and worked the vein with hand picks and chisels until noon when they came out into the sun for an hour to eat the meal Adela had laid out on a flat rock in front of the cabin. Then they went back in and worked until the light at the entrance began to fail. Tobias stayed at the entrance the whole day watching the timbers above their heads with the fierce attention of a younger brother who had already lost one brother to the mountain and had no intention of losing another. In the evenings, they processed the ore in a small sluice they had set up by the creek that ran past the camp, washing the broken rock through the wooden box and watching the heavier flecks of color settle into the riffles. Della kept the ledger. She wrote down every weight, every find, every hour. She cooked their meals over the small stove in the camp cabin, and she mended a tear in Tobias's shirt with thread from her own travel kit, and she boiled water, and she carried wood, and she made the hard work of the men possible by being the steady center of the small camp. On the third night, Wyatt sat down on the bench outside the camp cabin with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and watched the stars come out over the shoulder of the peak, and Della came out and sat down on the bench beside him without asking, and the two of them sat in silence for a long while. "Wyatt." "Yes, Della." "Tell me about him, about Elias. I never met him. I came 3,000 miles to marry him, and I never got to meet him, and I would like to know who he was." He thought about it for a long moment. He thought about all the things he could say. He chose the smallest one because the smallest one was the truest. He laughed easy, easier than the rest of us. When we were boys, our mother used to say Elias had been born with the laugh our father had lost somewhere along the way. He could find a joke in anything. He could find a joke in a broken plow handle, in a hailstorm, and a horse going lame in the middle of a creek crossing. The cabin sounded different when he was in it. It sounded warmer somehow. I did not know that until he was gone. "Wyatt." "Yes. I am sorry I did not get to hear him laugh." He looked at her. The starlight caught the edge of her face and made the small, thin scar above her eyebrow visible for a half second, and then it was gone, and Wyatt Ashcombe was a man who had been keeping a careful guard on his own heart since the day his mother died when he was 12 years old, and he felt that guard slip by another quarter inch in the cold night air on the bench outside the mining camp cabin. He did not say anything else. There was no need. On the morning of the fifth day, the weather changed. He felt it before he opened the door of the camp cabin. He felt it in the air pressure, and he felt it in the way the horses on the picket line were stamping and tossing their heads, and he felt it in the smell of the wind that was coming down off the peak. He stepped out into the dooryard and looked up at the sky and saw the long gray belly of cloud rolling in from the northwest, and he understood that they had perhaps half a day before the first real snow of the season came down on them and made the trail off the mountain dangerous. "We work until noon," he said when the others came out behind him. "Then we pack and ride. I will not be caught up here in a blow." They worked until noon. They worked harder than they had worked any of the other days because Wyatt could feel the time slipping out from under them and could not bear the thought of leaving the vein with one more day's worth of ore still in it that they might need. By the time the sky to the north had gone, the color of slate, they had pulled enough rock out of the cut to give them by Della's careful weighing and her best guess at the price they would get from the assayer in Stonewater Bend, perhaps $120 in raw ore. Not enough, not nearly enough to pay Crow what he was owed, but more than they had started with, and proof that the vein was real and could be worked, and that was a thing that mattered for what was coming next. It happened on the way out. They were retreating from the cut, Wyatt in the lead with the lantern, Beckett a few paces behind him with the last full sack of ore over his shoulder, and they were almost at the bend in the shaft where the floor began to slope back up toward the daylight. Wyatt heard the small, dry crack from the timber above his head a half-second before he understood what it meant, and in that half-second, a lifetime of working in mines and reading the sounds of stone and wood took over his body without consulting his brain. He spun. He shoved Beckett in the chest with both hands hard, harder than he had ever shoved his brother in his life. Beckett went stumbling backward into the bend of the shaft. The timber above where they had been standing came down with a sound like a rifle shot, and a section of the shaft roof the size of a wagon bed came down with it, and a chunk of rock the size of a stove glanced off the side of Wyatt Ashcombe's left calf as he was diving sideways out of the way. He felt the bone in his leg take the blow. He heard himself grunt with the pain of it. He hit the floor of the shaft on his right shoulder and his right elbow and skidded against the wall, and the lantern went out, and for a long, airless moment, there was no sound in the shaft except the sound of the dust settling and his own breathing and Beckett's voice somewhere ahead of him in the dark shouting his name. "Wyatt! Wyatt! Wyatt! I am here, Beck! I am here! Get the lantern lit!" A scratch of a match. A small flare of yellow, Beckett's white face above the flame, and then Beckett's hands on his shoulders, and Tobias's voice yelling from the entrance of the shaft, and Della's voice somewhere above Tobias's sharper and more frightened than Wyatt had ever heard it. "He is hurt. Bring him out. Bring him out, Beckett." Beckett got him up. Beckett got Wyatt's right arm over his own shoulders and half walked and half dragged him back up the slope of the shaft toward the daylight, and the pain in Wyatt's left leg was a hot white thing that took his breath every time the foot came down. They came out into the gray afternoon air with the first thin flakes of snow already drifting down out of the sky, and Tobias was there with his arm around Wyatt's other side, and Della was there with her face the color of fresh paper, and her clear blue eyes very large, and the four of them stumbled together to the camp cabin and got Wyatt down onto the bench by the door. Della was already kneeling. She had a knife from the kitchen in her hand, and she was cutting the leg of his denim trousers open from the boot to the knee with quick, clean strokes that did not waste motion. The cloth fell away. The wound underneath it was ugly, a long, ragged tear in the meat of his calf, where the rock had glanced off with the white bone showing in the deepest part of it, and the blood was coming out in a steady pulse that meant something inside the leg had been open. "Boil water, Beckett the kettle, Tobias my travel kit, the small leather one in the cabin, the one beside my trunk. Bring me the whiskey from the shelf and bring me a clean shirt from your brother's pack. Now both of you." They went. They had never been ordered around by a woman in their lives, and they went the way trained dogs go to a whistle because there was something in her voice that did not invite argument. She turned back to Wyatt. Her hands were already pressed against the wound to slow the bleeding, and her face was very close to his. "Wyatt, look at me." He looked at her. "This is going to hurt. I have to clean it, and I have to stitch it, and there is no doctor on this mountain. I learned how to do this on my uncle's farm, and I have done it on a horse, and on a hired man, and on a boy who fell out of a hayloft, and I am telling you I can do it. But it is going to hurt. Do you understand me?" "I understand." "Bite down on this." She had a strip of leather from somewhere. He did not see where she had gotten it from, and she folded it and put it between his teeth. "And do not look at the leg. Look at me, Yang. Just at me." Right. She worked. He looked at her. She poured the whiskey into the wound, and the world went white at the edges, and he bit down on the leather so hard he thought his teeth would crack. And her eyes did not leave his face, not once, not while she was wiping away the dirt, and not while she was threading the needle from her travel kit with the boiled black thread, and not while she was setting the first stitch into the meat of his calf, and the second, and the third, and the fourth. And she counted each one out loud in a quiet, steady voice, the way a woman counts stitches while she is mending a sock. And Wyatt Ashcombe lay back on the bench with snow falling on his face and his brother's mountain at his back. And the woman from Boston bent over his torn leg, and somewhere in the middle of the 12th stitch, he understood with a quiet, terrible clarity that he was in love with her. He had not asked permission of his own heart. His own heart had not asked permission of him. It had simply happened the way the snow had simply started falling, the way the timber in the shaft had simply cracked, the way his brother had simply died. It was a thing that was now and would not be unmade. She tied off the last stitch. She wiped the blood from her hands on the rag Tobias had brought her. She put her palm flat against Wyatt's forehead for a moment to check him for shock, and then she leaned down very close to his ear so that only he could hear her, and she said the words that would stay in his head for the rest of his life. "You will be all right, Wyatt. Winter always ends in these mountains." He closed his eyes. The snow fell on his face. Above him, somewhere in the deeper sky, the afternoon was sliding toward evening. And on the trail down the mountain, his brothers were beginning to break the camp and lash the loaded pack horse so that they could get the wounded man home before the storm closed the trail behind them. But here in this small, still moment, with a woman's hand on his forehead and a leather strip between his teeth and a freshly stitched wound in his leg, and a vein of gold in the rock above him that might just save his family's land, Wyatt Ashcombe lay with his eyes closed and let himself feel for the first time in a long time the simple, impossible warmth of being looked after by another human being. Far below them in the valley, in the warm parlor of a fine house in Stonewater Bend, a man named Vernon Crow was sitting down to a hot supper, unaware that the very people he intended to ruin were now walking back down the mountain with proof of his vein and a wound that would bind them tighter than any of his calculations had counted on. Winter was coming on. "Winter always ends in these mountains," the woman from Boston had said. But the four of them were coming down off the mountain together, and they were coming down stronger than they had gone up, and that was a thing Vernon Crow had not factored into his plans at all. They came down off the mountain in the dark. Beckett broke the trail with the lantern held high in his right hand and the lead rope of the pack horse wrapped around his left, and Tobias rode close behind him with Wyatt slumped against his chest and his good arm hooked around Wyatt's ribs to hold him in the saddle. And Della rode at the rear on the small bay gelding, with the snow gathering in the wool of her shawl, and her clear blue eyes never leaving the back of the man she had stitched on the bench in the camp dooryard before they set out. The first hard flakes had given way to a thicker, steadier fall by the time they reached the lower switchback, and by the time they came down through the last stand of pines and saw the dark shape of the cabin against the white of the dooryard, the world had gone almost silent in the way only a high country snowfall can make a world go silent. Wyatt was still conscious. Just. The pain in his calf had settled into a deep red throbbing thing that he could ride with as long as he did not look at it, and he kept his eyes on the back of his youngest brother's neck and counted his own breaths and did not let himself slide. They got him inside. They got him onto the rope-strung bed in the small back room because the loft ladder was out of the question, and Della stripped the boot off his good foot and laid the wool blanket over him and built up the fire in the stove until the small back room was warmer than the main room of the cabin. And Tobias stood in the doorway watching with the helpless face of a younger brother who had never had to watch an older brother go down before, and Beckett took the lantern back outside to see to the horses because Beckett could not stand still in a room where someone he loved was hurting and he never had been able to. That night was a long night. Della sat in the wooden chair beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on Wyatt's face, and she did not sleep. She got up once an hour to check the wound in his leg for fresh bleeding and to lay her palm against his forehead for fever. And twice in the night she went out to the kitchen to put more wood in the stove so that the heat would not fall off. And once near 3 in the morning, Wyatt opened his eyes in the lamplight and saw her sitting there and tried to say her name and could not get the word past the dryness in his mouth. And she was at the bedside in an instant with a tin cup of water held to his lips. Slow. He drank slow. Della, I am here. You should sleep. I will sleep when the fever does not come. It is not going to come. The whiskey did its work. I will sleep when I know that for certain. He looked at her in the lamplight. Her honey hair had come loose from its pins, and there were strands of it around her face, and there was a smudge of dried blood on the cuff of her sleeve from his own leg, and she did not look like a woman from Boston anymore. She did not look like anything he had a name for. She looked like the only person in the world he wanted in that chair beside that bed at 3 in the morning, and that was a fact he did not have the strength to argue with. He closed his eyes. He slept. When he woke, it was full daylight, and the fever had not come. The next 4 days, Wyatt Ashcombe was not allowed to set foot on the floor. This was Della's order, and it was an order Beckett enforced with a kind of grim satisfaction, because Beckett was a man who had been waiting his entire life to give his older brother an order he would have to obey. Wyatt lay in the small back room, and he watched the gray light at the window, and he listened to the sounds of the cabin going on around him. And the sounds of the cabin going on around him were not the sounds the cabin had made before Della had walked into it. Now there was the sound of bread being kneaded in the kitchen at mid-morning. Now there was the sound of 2 voices, hers and Tobias's, working through a passage in a book of poems Tobias had been carrying around for 3 years and had been afraid to show anyone. Now there was the sound of Beckett bringing in firewood and stacking it by the door without slamming it down the way he usually did, because there was a wounded man in the back room who needed quiet. And Beckett was capable of quiet when the situation required it, although he had never told a living soul. She came to the back room 4 times a day. She brought him broth in the morning, and stew at noon, and bread and milk in the afternoon, and broth again at night. And every time she came in, she changed the dressing on his leg with the same calm, efficient hands she had used in the mining camp. On the second afternoon, she brought a small, worn book with her and sat down in the chair beside the bed and asked him quietly if she could read to him. And he said yes, because he could not think of any reason to say no. And she opened the book and read him the first chapter of Walden by Henry Thoreau in a voice so even and quiet that he was asleep before she reached the second page. When he woke, the book was closed on her lap, and she was watching him. You snore, Wyatt Ashcombe. I do not. You do, not loudly, but you do. That is slander. A small, almost smile touched the corner of her mouth. I will not tell your brothers. I would appreciate that. She was quiet for a moment. Wyatt. Yes, Della. I want to ask you something. You do not have to answer it. But I have been sitting in this chair for 2 days, and there is a thing I want to know, and I am going to ask it while I have the courage. Ask. She set the book aside on the small table beside the bed. Why do you sleep in the barn? He did not understand the question for a moment. You have only slept in the loft of this cabin once since the day I came, and that was the very first night. Beckett told me. He thought I knew. You have been sleeping in the loft of the barn on a folded horse blanket for 9 nights since then in the cold with a hurt leg when there is a perfectly good loft in the cabin with your own bed in it. Why? He looked at her. He looked at the ceiling of the small back room. He looked at her again. Because there is a woman under this roof who is not my wife and not my sister, and the whole valley already has things to say about my family this month, and I will not give them one more thing to say. That is why. She did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been. Wyatt, the whole valley is going to say what the whole valley is going to say. You cannot stop them, and you are going to break your back sleeping on a horse blanket in a coal barn for the sake of people who never thanked you for anything you ever did for them in your life. Move back into the loft tonight. Please, I am not afraid of you. I have never been afraid of you. If I am to be the cause of you sleeping in the barn for 6 months, I would rather get on the eastbound train tomorrow and save you the trouble. He was quiet for a long time. I will move back into the loft tonight. Thank you. Della. Yes. You are not the cause of anything in this house except a great deal of bread that we did not deserve. The almost smile touched the corner of her mouth again. I have been told I make a passable biscuit. You make better than that. She picked up the book again and went on reading where she had left off, and Wyatt Ashcombe lay back on the pillow and listened to her read the words of a man who had once gone to the woods to live deliberately, and he understood that he had been doing exactly that for 10 years without ever quite knowing why, and that perhaps the reason for it had only just walked into his cabin 9 days ago. That night, for the first time since Della Merriweather had stepped down off the morning train, Wyatt Ashcombe slept under his own roof. He climbed the ladder to the loft after the lamps were out, and he stretched out on his own straw tick mattress, and the sound of the woman breathing quietly in the back room below him was the strangest and most settling sound he had heard in many years. On the 5th day, he was up on his feet with a cane Beckett had cut him from a length of seasoned ash. On the 7th day, he was walking the dooryard with the cane and a slight limp and a dark mood because a man who has spent his life in motion does not take well to a wounded leg. On the 9th day, a rider came up the road from the valley. It was not the sheriff this time. It was a stranger. The 4 of them stood on the porch and watched him come. He was a thin, sharp-dressed man in a dark coat with a leather satchel buckled across his saddle, and he reined his horse to a stop in front of the cabin and touched the brim of his hat to Wyatt with a coldness that did not pretend to be politeness. Mr. Wyatt Ashcombe, that is me. My name is Royce Hennessy. I am here representing Mr. Vernon Crow of Stonewater Bend. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat. Mr. Crow has instructed me to deliver this to you in person and to obtain your acknowledgement of receipt. Wyatt did not move from where he was standing on the porch with one hand on the cane. Read it to me where you sit, Hennessy. I am not coming down off this porch, and I am not inviting you up onto it. The thin man's mouth tightened, but he opened the paper. Notice of adjusted claim. Be advised that as of this date, the original loan instrument of $300 dated May the 12th, made by Vernon Crow, to the late Elias Ashcombe, has been formally transferred to Wyatt Ashcombe as the surviving heir of the Ashcombe estate. Be further advised that due to the failure of the surviving heir to remit payment within the agreed period, an adjusted balance of $450 is now due, said balance reflecting accrued interest, late penalty, and administrative cost. Said balance must be paid in full within 14 days of this notice, in coin or an equivalent value, or the mining claim known as the Ashcombe Cut shall be subject to seizure and sale by order of the territorial court. The thin man looked up. He has changed the number, Beckett said quietly from behind Wyatt. He has changed the number, Wyatt said. He cannot change the number, Tobias said. He just did, Della said. Hennessy folded the paper carefully and held it out toward the porch. "Mr. Ashcombe, your acknowledgement, please." Wyatt did not take the paper. He looked at Hennessy for a long beat, and then he said in a voice as flat and quiet as the snow in the dooryard, "Tell Vernon Crow that an Ashcombe man pays his honest debts and answers his dishonest ones in court. Now turn that horse around and ride down off this mountain before my brother Beckett decides he does not like the cut of your coat." Beckett behind him made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Hennessy looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at Hennessy. Whatever Hennessy saw in Beckett's hard amber gaze was enough to convince him that the cut of his coat was in fact in some danger. He folded the paper back into his vest, touched the brim of his hat with the stiffness of a man who has been thoroughly insulted and cannot do anything about it, and turned his horse and rode back down the road toward Stonewater Bend without another word. The four of them stood on the porch in the cold sunlight and watched him go. 450, Tobias said. "Wyatt, we do not have 120. Della weighed it twice." "I know what we have, Toby." "Then what are we going to do?" Wyatt did not answer. He was looking at Della. Della was looking at the road where Hennessy had ridden, and her mouth was a thin line and her eyes were doing the same calculating thing they had done on the train platform on the morning she arrived. He could almost see the columns of figures running behind her eyes. She turned to him. "Wyatt, there is a thing in my trunk I have not told you about. I want to show it to you. Inside. All four of us." They went inside. She opened her travel trunk and lifted out a small velvet pouch from beneath the folded linens, and she set it on the kitchen table and untied the drawstring, and she turned the pouch out onto the wood. A string of pearls, a small gold ring with a single garnet stone, a cameo brooch carved from white shell on a setting of dark coral, a pair of small pearl earrings on silver wires. The four pieces lay on the table in the lamplight, and the three Ashcombe brothers looked down at them in silence. "My grandmother's pearls," Della said. "The ring belonged to my mother's elder sister, who died before I was born. The brooch was a gift to me from my godmother on my 16th birthday. The earrings were the only thing I had left from my own mother that she did not take back from me when I left the house. Together, I believe they are worth perhaps $160 in Boston. In Denver, where the jewelers know what they are looking at, I think they will fetch nearly 200. Della?" Wyatt said. "I know what you are going to say." "Della, no. I know what you are going to say, Wyatt Ashcombe, and the answer is yes. These are not heirlooms anymore. They were heirlooms in a house I no longer live in, given to me by people who do not write to me. They are tools now. They are the tools we have, and we are going to use them because there is no other tool on this table that will do the job that needs doing. Della. And we are going to need a lawyer too, a real one. Not the man who keeps an office above the saddler's shop in Stonewater Bend. A real lawyer who can stand up in a real court and put Vernon Crow in front of a judge who is not his cousin. I know the name of one. Her name is Adelaide Thornberry. She practices in Denver. She represented my uncle in Concord 7 years ago when a man tried to take his farm by exactly this kind of paper trick, and she destroyed that man in court so completely that he left the state. I have her address in my trunk. She owes my family no favors, but she will remember the case and she will take the meeting. And she does not work for free, Wyatt. So we will take the pieces with us and we will sell them in Denver, and we will hire her in the same hour, and we will come back down off that train with the woman who was going to put Vernon Crow in the ground for what he did to your brother. The kitchen was very quiet. Beckett was looking at her with an expression Wyatt had never seen on his middle brother's face before. It was not anger and it was not approval. It was something more complicated and more careful than either of those things. And Wyatt understood that his middle brother had just understood something about the woman from Boston that he had not understood 10 minutes earlier, and that whatever Beckett thought of her now, he was going to think it for a long time. Tobias was looking at the pearls on the table with a kind of stricken reverence. Wyatt himself could not speak for a moment. When he could, he said only one thing. Della, those are yours. They were mine. Now they are ours. There is a difference, Wyatt, and you know there is. The word ours hung in the air between them in the quiet kitchen, and Wyatt Ashcombe felt a thing settle in his chest that was either the heaviest thing he had ever carried or the lightest, and he could not tell which. He nodded once. All right, Della, we do it your way. We leave for Denver in the morning. It was on the morning they were to leave that the second blow fell. Wyatt was up before dawn, as always, building the fire in the Franklin stove and putting the coffee on, and he had just stepped out into the dooryard with the empty pail to fetch water when he stopped because something was wrong with the smell of the air. There was wood smoke in it, and there should not have been wood smoke in it because the only chimney for 2 miles was the one above his own head, and his fire had only just been lit. He turned slowly and looked toward the barn. The barn was on fire. It was not yet a fully grown fire. It was the small, mean orange tongue of a fire that had been set deliberately on the windward side in a pile of straw and kindling that had been laid against the outer wall by a hand that knew what it was doing. The flames had taken hold of the dry cedar boards and were beginning to climb. There was no wind, thank God, but there was no time either. He shouted. He shouted his brother's names, and he shouted Della's name, and he dropped the pail, and he ran for the barn. Even on his bad leg, in his shout, brought all 3 of them out of the cabin in their night clothes within seconds. The horses were already screaming in the barn. Beckett was halfway across the dooryard before he had his boots on. Tobias was right behind him with a wool blanket already in his hands. Della came out last with a wide-eyed, steady face and a bucket in each hand from the kitchen, and she ran for the trough without being told. They got the horses out, all 3 saddle horses, including the small bay gelding Della had been riding, and the old draft horse came stampeding out into the dooryard, with their eyes rolling and the smell of smoke in their manes, and Wyatt got the doors of the corral open and drove them through and slammed the gate behind them. They fought the fire for nearly an hour, bucket after bucket from the trough and from the creek, blankets soaked and beaten against the climbing flames, Beckett up on the slope of the barn roof with an axe knocking out the cedar shakes that had caught so the fire could not spread along the spine. Tobias and Della below in a chain passing buckets, and Wyatt himself working with a bad leg and a worse fury, and in the end they saved most of it. The east wall was a loss. The hayloft above the east wall was a loss. The harness rack along that wall was a charred ruin. But the structure stood, and the horses were alive, and the fire did not reach the cabin. When the last of it was beaten out, and the 4 of them stood in the smoking dooryard with their hands and faces black and their night clothes soaked through, Tobias was the one who saw it. He bent down by a fence post 20 feet from the barn and picked something up out of the trampled snow. Wyatt, he held it out. It was a silver button, a coat button carved with a small ornate letter C. The kind of button no working man in the territory of Colorado would ever sew onto a coat, and the kind of button that one man in Stonewater Bend was known to wear on the lapel of his fine dark suit because he had ordered them special from a tailor in St. Louis. Wyatt took the button. He closed his fist around it. A small folded paper had been left pinned to the corral post by a knife. He had not seen it at first because of the smoke. He went and pulled the knife out of the wood and unfolded the paper and read the line that had been written on it in a careful, unhurried hand. Last warning. Sell the claim or lose the house. V.C. Beckett came up behind him and read the words over his shoulder, and Wyatt heard the long, slow breath go out of his middle brother and felt Beckett's hand tighten on his shoulder, and he knew without turning that Beckett's other hand was already moving toward the place where his pistol would have been if he had been wearing it. Wyatt, no Beckett. Wyatt, the time for no is past. Look at this. I am looking at this. He has come onto our land. He has set fire to our barn. He has signed his name to it like he believes there is not one thing in this world we can do to him. The time for Denver lawyers is past. The time for paper is past. I am going to saddle the roan, and I am going to ride down into Stonewater Bend, and I am going to find him in his parlor, and I am going to put a bullet through his throat, and you are not going to stop me this time, brother, because I am done being stopped. Beckett. Do not Beckett. Me, Wyatt. Beckett turned to go for the corral. Della stepped in front of him. She did it without a sound. One moment she was standing 6 feet behind the brothers with the empty bucket still hanging from her hand, and the next moment she was between Beckett and the corral gate with her small body squared up and her clear blue eyes lifted to his face, and her hand was on the front of his shirt the way a woman lays her hand on a runaway horse to bring it down. Beckett Ashcombe. Move Della. No. Moved her. No, you are going to listen to me for 30 seconds. After that, if you still mean to do what you are about to do, I will move and you can ride. 30 seconds, Beckett. I am asking you. He stood there shaking with the rage of it, his eyes bright and fevered, his chest heaving under her small, steady hand, and he did not move and he did not strike her hand away. Talk. He set this fire so you would do exactly what you are about to do. He set it so you would ride down into town with murder in your face and finish his work for him. If you ride out of this dooryard with that pistol on your hip, you will be in the Stonewater Bend jail by sundown, and you will hang inside of 2 weeks, and the last thing your brother Elias did in his life was write down the name of his killer in a journal under a floorboard so that we could put that name in front of a real court of law in Denver. Are you going to throw that away? Are you going to throw away the last thing your brother did, the very thing he died trying to leave you because Vernon Crow set a fire and counted on your temper? Are you Beckett Ashcombe? He was breathing hard. Are you? The fight went out of him by inches. She watched it go. His shoulders came down a 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, and his hand, which had been moving toward his hip, stopped moving, and his eyes closed for a long moment and opened again, wet at the lashes. And he looked down at the small woman from Boston with her hand still flat against his shirt, and he said in a voice that was not anything like his usual voice at all, "You are right, Della. Good help me. You are right." She put her arms around Beckett Ashcombe's chest and hugged him hard just once, the way a sister hugs a brother who has been brought back from a cliff edge, and she let him go. He turned and walked away into the smoke without another word. That night, the four of them sat together on the bench in front of the cabin in the deep cold, under a sky full of stars, and they made a plan. They would leave for Denver at first light. All four of them. They would take the pearls and the ring and the brooch and the earrings, and they would take the journal, and they would take the silver button with the letter C, and they would take the threatening note, and they would take everything else they had, and they would lay all of it on the desk of Adelaide Thornberry in Denver, and they would let her decide how to put Vernon Crow in the ground with the law instead of with a bullet. There would be no detour and no delay and no riding into Stonewater Bend on the way out. They would skirt the town on the high trail, and they would camp the first night by the headwaters of Whisper Creek, and they would be in Denver by noon of the second day. And if she will not take the case, Beckett said quietly into the dark. She will take it, Della said. How do you know? Because I am going to tell her that the man who tried to take my uncle's farm in Concord 7 years ago is the same kind of man who burned this barn last night, and she is going to remember the look on her face the day she destroyed him in court, and she is going to want that look on her face again. I know her, Beckett. I sat in her parlor when I was 15 years old and listened to her tell my uncle that the law was a sword for the people who knew how to swing it, and I have never forgotten one word of what she said. She will take it. Beckett looked at her in the starlight for a long, quiet moment. Della. Yes, Beckett. Thank you for stopping me this morning. I would have ridden into that town and I would have died for nothing, and Elias would have died for nothing too, and I do not know what kind of man I would be in the next world if I had to face him with that on my soul. You do not have to thank me, Beckett. That is what family does. The word family sat there in the cold dark between them for a long moment, and then Beckett Ashcombe nodded once slowly and looked away into the stars. The four of them sat together a while longer in the cold and the quiet, with the smell of burned cedar still on the air and the high country stars hardening in the blasts above the peak, and after a while Tobias said softly, "I am going to go to Denver and become a doctor." It came out of nowhere. Wyatt turned his head to look at his youngest brother in the starlight. "Toby, I am. I have been thinking about it for a year, and I never said it out loud because I knew there was no money for it, and there is still no money for it, but I am saying it now because I want all three of you to know it. After this is done, after Crow is in the ground and the claim is ours and the trouble is past, I am going to Denver and I am going to find a man who will take me on as a student, and I am going to learn how to set bones and stitch wounds and deliver babies, and I am going to come back to Stonewater Bend and be its doctor." Della knew. "I told her last week. I am telling the rest of you now." Wyatt did not answer for a moment. He was looking at his youngest brother and seeing a boy he did not entirely recognize, a boy who had grown into a man under his nose while he had been busy looking the other way. "Toby." "Yes, Wyatt. That is the best thing I have heard anyone in this family say in 2 years. You go. You go to Denver after this is done, and you do not come back until you have the letters after your name, and your brothers are going to be proud enough of you to bust the buttons off our shirts. Do you hear me?" Tobias did not answer with words. He just nodded once in the starlight, and Wyatt saw the wet shine in the boy's amber eyes and looked away to give his brother the dignity of it. Della reached over in the dark and took Wyatt's hand without saying anything, and she wove her fingers between his fingers and held on, and Wyatt Ashcombe held on back. And the four of them sat there in the cold, high country night with the smoke of a burned barn behind them and the road to Denver in front of them, and there was something in the way they sat that was different from the way the same four people had sat in the same place a week earlier. They were not strangers anymore. They were not employer and employee. They were not brothers and a guest. They were a family. They were a family that had been built in 3 weeks out of a telegram and a journal under a floorboard and a wounded leg and a burned barn and a row of pearls on a kitchen table, and there was no name for what they were that any preacher would have understood, but it was a true thing nonetheless, and all four of them knew it, and none of them said it out loud. They went inside. They slept what little sleep they could. Before first light, Wyatt was up in the loft pulling on his coat, and Beckett was in the kitchen rolling biscuits into a cloth for the saddlebags, and Tobias was in the barn checking the horses for soot in their lungs and finding none. And Della was in the small back room, packing the velvet pouch and the journal and the silver button and the threatening note into the inside pocket of her traveling cloak, so that no one and nothing could take them from her on the road. The sky to the east was beginning to go that pale, clean color that comes before a winter sunrise, and there was no wind, and the smell of burned cedar was already fading off the dooryard as the cold of the night carried it away. They mounted up. Wyatt led them out of Ashcombe Hollow on Hickory with his cane lashed to the saddle in case his leg gave out on the long ride. Beckett rode the roan beside him with his rifle in the saddle scabbard and his pistol on his hip, and a quiet steadiness in his face that had not been there a week ago. Tobias rode the old draft horse with the pack horse on a lead behind him and a small leather satchel of bread and cured meat strapped to the cantle. Della rode the same small bay gelding she had ridden on the cattle drive, the one Tobias had given over to her, without a word of complaint, and she sat the horse with the easy seat of a woman who had been riding since she was a girl, and her honey hair was tucked up under the brim of a wide hat Tobias had pressed on her at the door, because the sun off the snow would burn her face raw before noon. At the top of the rise above the hollow, Wyatt reined Hickory to a stop and turned in the saddle and looked back. The cabin sat in the dooryard with its single window catching the first pink of the dawn. The barn beyond it stood with its scorched east wall and its proud living spine. The hill behind the cabin where his brother Elias slept under the pine marker was just beginning to show in the new light. Beyond all of it, the great flat-shouldered mass of Ashcombe Peak rose against the brightening sky with the new snow on its high faces, and the whole hollow lay quiet and waiting in the way. Mountains lie quiet and wait when something is about to be decided in them. Wyatt Ashcombe looked at all of it, He thought of his grandfather who had come west from Tennessee with nothing and laid claim to this land. He thought of his father who had held it through hard winters and harder summers. He thought of his mother who had washed their shirts in the creek and died in the back room of the cabin when Wyatt was 12 years old. He thought of his brother Elias in the ground on the hill who had ordered a wife by mail because he had wanted more than anything in his short life to fill that cabin with the laughter their father had lost. And he thought of the woman riding the small bay gelding beside him, whose hand had been in his in the starlight the night before, and whose pearls were sewn into the inside pocket of her cloak, and whose stitches were holding the meat of his calf together under his trousers, and whose name he had known for 3 weeks, and whose presence had already become the thing he could not imagine the cabin without. He turned Hickory's head back toward the trail. "Let us go to Denver," he said. The four of them rode down out of Ashcombe Hollow in the pink light of the high country dawn, and the trail took them around the shoulder of the lower hill and out of sight of the cabin, and the cabin sat empty behind them in the morning quiet for the first time in 3 weeks. And on the kitchen table inside, beneath a clean cloth Della had laid down before they left, 4 tin plates were set out for a supper that would not be eaten until the 4 of them came back down off that road with a Denver lawyer at their side and the future of Ashcombe Hollow in their hands. Behind the cabin on the hill in the new light, the wildflowers Della had laid the day before on the grave of a man she had never met were already beginning to be dusted with the first thin powder of the coming snow. Winter was almost on them, but winter always ends in these mountains, the woman from Boston had said, and the 4 of them were riding strong, and they were riding for the man in the ground on the hill behind them, and there was not one of them in that small column on the trail who did not know it. They reached Denver by noon of the second day. The city took Della by the throat for a moment when they came down off the high road and saw it spread out in the long bowl of the plains beneath the mountains. It had been 4 months since she had set eyes on a city of any size, and she had not realized how much she had let the silence of Ashcombe Hollow soak into her bones, until she was suddenly riding through streets full of carriages and gas lamps and shop signs and the hot bright noise of human commerce. The 3 Ashcombe brothers rode close around her without quite seeming to the way men ride around a woman when they are not certain what the city might do to her, and Wyatt led them straight to a small, respectable boarding house off Larimer Street that had been recommended to him years ago by an old cattle buyer he trusted, and he paid out 2 of his last coins for a room for Della and a single room for the 3 brothers to share. They washed the trail dust off their faces. They ate a hot meal in the boarding house parlor, and then in the middle of the afternoon of the second day, the 4 of them walked the 6 blocks to the office of Adelaide Thornberry, attorney at law. The office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building above a saddlery. There was a small painted sign at the foot of the stair. A. Thornberry, Esquire. The 4 of them climbed the wooden stairs in single file, and at the top, Della knocked twice on the frosted glass door, and a woman's voice from inside called out clear and businesslike for them to come in. The room beyond was not what Wyatt had expected. He had expected a lawyer's office to be all dark wood and leather books and the smell of cigars, and there was some of that, but there was also a tall window letting in the late afternoon sun and a vase of dried prairie sage on the desk and a row of framed certificates on the wall. And behind the desk, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pinned up severe and a face that had been shaped by hard work and good schooling in roughly equal measure. She was on her feet before Della had taken 3 steps into the room. "Cordelia Merriweather, Miss Thornberry, you have grown up." "I have had to." The 2 women crossed the room and embraced once briefly and hard the way women embrace who have not seen each other in 7 years, and who are each silently calculating how much of what they are about to say will be old business and how much will be new. Then Adelaide Thornberry stepped back and looked past Della at the 3 large men standing awkwardly inside the door of her office, and she said in the same clear businesslike voice, "Gentlemen, please, sit." There were not enough chairs. Tobias remained standing by the door. Wyatt and Beckett took the 2 leather chairs facing the desk, and Della took the third smaller chair beside Wyatt's, and Adelaide Thornberry sat back down behind her desk and folded her hands on the blotter and looked at them all for one long, unhurried moment. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, leave nothing out." It took Della almost an hour to tell it. She told it well in the same calm, steady voice she had used on the train platform in Stonewater Bend on the morning she arrived, and Adelaide Thornberry did not interrupt her once. When Della was finished, she opened the inside pocket of her cloak and laid out on the desk in order each of the things she had carried down off the mountain. The journal. The last entry opened to the right page. The silver button. The threatening note. The folded letter from the sheriff. The original loan claim Vernon Crow had filed against the Ashcombe estate. The new adjusted notice from Royce Hennessy. And then last of all, the small velvet pouch with the pearls and the ring and the brooch and the earrings, which she set apart from the rest because they were the means and not the evidence. Adelaide Thornberry looked at the things on her desk for a long time. She picked up the silver button. She turned it in her finger. She set it back down. She picked up the journal. She read the last entry. She read it twice. She set the journal down. She picked up the loan claim and the adjusted notice and laid them side by side and ran her finger down the dollar amounts. Then she sat back in her chair and looked across the desk at the four of them, and her face had changed in a way that Wyatt did not entirely understand until she spoke. "Vernon Crow." "Yes," Della said. "You are certain that is the name on the loan papers?" "Yes." "And the man you are describing, tall, heavy through the shoulders, dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, owns a number of mining interests in your part of the territory, wears a fine dark coat with silver buttons, made by a tailor in St. Louis." "That is him exactly." Adelaide Thornberry was very still for a moment. Then she got up from her desk and walked over to a tall wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the office and unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key from her belt, and she drew out a thick leather-bound folder and brought it back to the desk and set it down and opened it. "I have been waiting 7 years for someone to walk through that door with this man's name on their lips." Wyatt felt the room change around him. "What?" "Vernon Crow is not Vernon Crow." Adelaide Thornberry laid her hand flat on the leather folder. "His name is Samuel Brackett. He is wanted by the United States federal government on a sealed warrant out of the state of Pennsylvania dated October of 1872. The warrant is for fraud, theft of mineral rights, conspiracy to defraud, and the suspected murder of a man named John Halloran in Schuylkill County, who died in a mine collapse 3 days after he refused to sell his claim to a man fitting Brackett's exact description. The federal marshal's office in Philadelphia has been hunting him for 7 years. He went west and he changed his name and he opened the same operation in Colorado that he had run in Pennsylvania, and he has been getting away with it for almost a decade because nobody in this territory ever connected the two names." Beckett was leaning forward in his chair now. "You can prove this." "I can prove all of it, Odd. I have a copy of the original warrant in this folder. I have a sworn affidavit from John Halloran's widow describing the man who came to her husband's office. I have a daguerreotype of Samuel Brackett taken in Philadelphia in 1871 before he went west. I have been corresponding with the federal marshal's office in Pennsylvania for the last 3 years, ever since I first heard the name Vernon Crow mentioned in connection with a similar pattern of land grabs in this territory. I have not been able to act because I have not had a single witness in Colorado willing to put his name on a complaint." Adelaide Thornberry looked at Wyatt across the desk. "Until now." Wyatt did not speak. He could not. There was a roaring in his ears like the sound of a creek in flood. It was Della who spoke. "What do we do?" "You do not do anything, I do." Adelaide Thornberry was already opening a drawer of her desk and taking out a sheet of telegram paper. "I am wiring the federal marshal in Philadelphia tonight. I am asking him to send a deputy west on the next eastbound train with the original warrant and the daguerreotype. That deputy will be in Stonewater Bend within 10 days. In the meantime, I am filing an emergency motion in the territorial court here in Denver to freeze any action against the Ashcombe mining claim pending federal investigation." Vernon Crow will not be able to take 1 square foot of your land until this is resolved. And when the federal deputy arrives with that warrant, we are going to walk into the Stonewater Bend courthouse together, all of us. And we are going to put Samuel Brackett in irons in front of every man and woman in that valley. She looked up from the telegram paper. Now, about the matter of my fee. Della reached for the velvet pouch. Adelaide Thornberry held up a hand. No, Della stopped. No, the lawyer said again more quietly. Put those away, Cordelia. I am not going to take a string of pearls from you to do this work. I am going to take this case for the standard fee, and I am going to send the bill to the federal government when this is over, because the warrant on Samuel Brackett carries a $500 reward for information leading to his capture, and I intend to claim every penny of that reward and bill the marshal's office for my services on top of it. Your pearls are going back to Ashcombe Hollow with you, and you are going to wear them at your wedding, and that is the end of this conversation. Della stared at her. My wedding. Adelaide Thornberry looked at Della. Then she looked very deliberately at Wyatt Ashcombe, sitting in the leather chair beside her, with his cane across his knees. And then she looked back at Della, and the corner of her mouth lifted in the smallest dry smile. My dear, I am a lawyer. I read evidence for a living. There is evidence in this room that has nothing to do with Vernon Crow. Wyatt felt the back of his neck go hot. Della did not answer, but her hand, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, slid by half an inch and came to rest against the side of Wyatt's hand where it gripped the head of his cane, and she did not move it away. And Wyatt did not move his away either, and Adelaide Thornberry did not look at either of them, but went on writing her telegram in her clear lawyer's hand. They left her office an hour later with the promise of action and the velvet pouch unspent in Della's pocket. And they walked back to the boarding house in the long blue dusk of a Denver winter evening, and not one of the four of them said a word the whole way, because there was nothing left in any of them that needed saying. They started back for Ashcombe Hollow the next morning. The ride home took 2 days, the same as the ride out, but it was a different ride, boss. The four of them moved through the mountain country with a quiet confidence that had not been in them on the way to Denver, because they were no longer riding into the unknown. They were riding into a battle they were going to win. Wyatt led them, and Beckett rode at his right hand, and Tobias rode behind with the pack horse, and Della rode in the middle of them, in the place a queen rides when she's being escorted home by her own knights. And on the second night, they camped again at the headwaters of Whisper Creek. And around the small fire, Wyatt and Della sat next to each other on a single fallen log, and her shoulder rested against his, and neither of them mentioned it. They reached Ashcombe Hollow on the afternoon of the fourth day. The cabin was as they had left it. The barn with its scorched east wall was as they had left it. The grave on the hill behind the cabin was as they had left it, with the wildflowers Della had placed there before the journey now buried under a thin, clean layer of new snow. The mountain was waiting for them the way mountains wait. They unsaddled the horses. They built up the fire in the Franklin stove. Della put a pot of beans on to cook, and Tobias went out to feed the chickens, and Beckett went up the hill to the grave to tell his brother the news in private, and Wyatt stood on the porch with his cane and watched the last of the daylight go out of the western sky. Della came out and stood beside him. Wyatt. Yes, Della. In 10 days, a federal deputy is going to ride into Stonewater Bend, and Adelaide Thornberry is going to put Vernon Crow in irons. And then it will be over. Yes. And then what? He looked down at her. The lamplight was coming through the cabin window behind them, and it caught the side of her face the way it had caught it on her first night under his roof, and he saw the small, thin scar above her eyebrow, and he saw the lift of her chin, and he saw the woman who had walked into his life 3 weeks ago and made it impossible for him to go back to the man he had been before her. And then he said quietly, I would like to ask you a question, but not tonight. Tonight I would like you to go inside and eat your supper and sleep in the back room and let yourself be tired. The question will keep until tomorrow. Wyatt. Yes. I already know what the question is. I know you do. And I already know what the answer is going to be. I know that too. She did not say anything else. She reached out and put her gloved hand on his where it rested on the porch rail, and she squeezed it once, and then she turned and went inside. He stood on the porch alone for a long while after that, watching the stars come out over Ashcombe Peak. The 10 days that followed were the slowest 10 days of Wyatt Ashcombe's life, and also somehow the fullest. Snow came twice. The cattle were brought in closer to the cabin for the winter. Tobias chopped and stacked enough firewood to last until spring. Beckett rode the fence line every other day with his rifle across his saddle, watching for any sign that Vernon Crow might try one last desperate move before the law caught up with him. Della ran the cabin and the kitchen in the small evening hours, when the four of them sat together by the stove and talked the way a family talks, when the worst of a long fear is coming to an end. On the 11th day, a rider came up the road from the valley. It was Sheriff Hollis Drennan, and beside him on a tall bay gelding rode a man Wyatt had never seen before. A stocky, weathered man in his middle 40s with a trimmed gray mustache and a federal marshal's badge pinned to the front of his coat. Drennan reined his horse to a stop in the dooryard, and the federal man dismounted and walked up to the porch and touched the brim of his hat to Wyatt and to Della. "Mr. Ashcombe, Miss Merriweather, my name is Ezra Finch. I am a Deputy United States Marshal out of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. I have been hunting a man named Samuel Brackett for 7 years, and Miss Adelaide Thornberry of Denver has informed me by wire that he is currently residing in your valley under the name of Vernon Crow." He paused. "Sheriff Drennan and I are riding into Stonewater Bend in 1 hour to arrest him. I would consider it a courtesy if the four of you would ride down with us so that Mr. Brackett can see the faces of the people he tried to ruin at the moment he is taken into federal custody." Wyatt looked at Della. Della looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at Wyatt. "We will ride with you," Wyatt said. They saddled up. The 7 of them rode down the mountain road into Stonewater Bend in the cold, clear noon light of a Colorado winter day. The 4 Ashcombes and Della in the middle, and Sheriff Drennan and Marshal Finch leading the way, and word ran ahead of them through the town, the way word runs through a frontier town, when something is about to happen, so that by the time they reached the main street, there were faces in every shop window and on every porch. Vernon Crow was at the bank. He came out of the front door of the Stonewater Bend Mercantile and Trust with a leather satchel in his hand and a fine dark coat with silver buttons on the lapel, and he stopped on the top step of the bank when he saw the 7 mounted figures ranged across the street in front of him. His face went through 3 expressions in less than a second: surprise, calculation, and then finally the dawning understanding of a man who has been running for 7 years and who has just been told the running is over. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. Beckett's rifle came out of the saddle scabbard so fast it was almost a blur. "Touch that pistol, Crow. Give me a reason. I am asking you nicely." Crow's hand stopped. Marshal Ezra Finch swung down off his bay and walked across the dusty street with the calm, steady stride of a man who had walked across a great many dusty streets in the course of his career. He climbed the steps of the bank. He stopped 1 pace in front of Vernon Crow. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up. "Samuel Brackett, by the authority of the federal warrant in my hand, dated October the 14th of 1872, you are under arrest for the murder of John Halloran of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, and for fraud, theft of mineral rights, and conspiracy to defraud the citizens of the United States. You will surrender your weapon to me now, or you will be shot where you stand." The whole street had gone silent. The whole town was watching. Vernon Crow, who was Samuel Brackett, looked past the federal marshal and across the dusty street at Wyatt Ashcombe, sitting on his horse, and at Della Merriweather sitting on the small bay gelding beside him. And the look that went across his face in that moment was the look of a man who understood finally and completely that the woman from Boston who had stepped down off a morning train 3 weeks ago had brought him down without ever raising a hand against him. He drew his pistol from inside his coat with 2 fingers and handed it butt first to the federal marshal. "I want a lawyer." "You will have a lawyer," Marshal Finch said. You will have a fair trial in a federal courtroom in Philadelphia. That is more than John Halloran got. That is more than Elias Ashcombe got. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." He did. Marshall Finch put the irons on him in front of the entire town of Stonewater Ven. The cheer that went up from the crowd was not a polite cheer. It was the cheer of a frontier town that had been afraid of one man for years and had just discovered that the man could be brought down by the law after all. And Wyatt Ashcombe heard it the way you hear a sound you have been waiting your whole life to hear. And he turned in his saddle and looked at Della Merriweather and saw that she was watching him, and only him, and her clear blue eyes were full and shining. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she answered. They rode home that evening as the sun was going down behind Ashcombe Peak. That night, after the supper plates were cleared and Beckett had gone out to see to the horses and Tobias had retreated to his loft with a book, Wyatt led Della up the hill behind the cabin to the grave of his brother in the soft new snow. He carried a lantern in his free hand. The mountain was very quiet. The stars were coming out. They stopped at the marker. Wyatt set the lantern down in the snow. "Elias." He spoke to the marker as if it could hear him. He had never done that before. He had not been able to do it in all the months since the burial. Tonight he could. "Brother, the man who killed you is in irons tonight. He is going back to Pennsylvania to hang for what he did to you and what he did to a man named John Halloran before you. You did not die for nothing. You wrote his name in a book, and you hid the book under a floorboard, and the woman you sent for found it on her first day under our roof, and she carried it down off this mountain with her own hands and laid it on the desk of a lawyer in Denver. And that is how we got him. You did this, brother, you and her. The two of you together." He stopped. He looked over at Della, who was standing beside him in her gray cloak, with her hair coming loose around her face the way it always came loose by the end of the day. And he understood that what he was about to do next was the hardest and most important thing he had ever done in his life. "Elias." "Yes, brother. There is one more thing I have to tell you." He turned to face Della. He took her hands in both of his. He spoke not to the marker now, but to her. "Cordelia Merriweather, you came west to marry my brother. My brother died before you got here, and you stayed anyway, and you saved my family's land, and you saved my brother Beckett from putting a bullet in a man and ending up at the end of a rope, and you stitched my leg back together when I would have bled out on a bench in the snow, and you walked into a Denver Lex lawyer's office with a velvet pouch in your hand, and you brought down the man who killed my brother. You did all of that in 3 weeks. And somewhere in the middle of those 3 weeks, without ever asking my permission, you became the only thing in this world that I cannot imagine the rest of my life without." She did not interrupt him. Her hands tightened on his. "I know you came here to marry Elias. I know that. I am not Elias, and I will never be Elias. But I am asking you, Della, in front of my brother who is in this ground, and my brothers who are in that cabin, and the mountain that has been the only home my family has ever known, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. Not because of any contract, not because of any obligation, because I love you and because I cannot any longer pretend that I do not." She did not speak at first. Then she lifted her gloved hand and laid it against the side of his face the way a woman lays her hand against the face of a man she has been waiting to touch for a long time, and she said in a voice quieter than the wind in the pines, "Yes, Wyatt Ashcombe. The answer is yes. The answer was yes the moment you carried my trunk off that train platform. I just did not know how to say it until tonight." He bent down and he kissed her once gently. In the lantern light beside his brother's grave, and the snow began to fall in slow, soft flakes around them. And on the hill behind the cabin in the high country of Colorado, in the last week of October of 1879, a woman from Boston and a mountain man from Tennessee, Stock made each other a promise that neither one of them would ever break. A letter came from Boston 3 days later. It had been written by a hand that Della did not at first recognize, and then she recognized it, and her face went very still. The letter was from a Boston attorney named Mr. Coddington, who had been her mother's family lawyer for 30 years. He wrote with the formal restraint of a man who had been instructed to deliver hard news as gently as possible. Della's mother, Eleanor Merriweather, had died of a winter fever on the 18th day of October. She had been ill for only a week. At the end, she had asked Mr. Coddington to write to her daughter in Colorado and to enclose a letter of her own, which she had composed 2 months earlier, and entrusted to him for delivery in the event of her death. Della read the lawyer's letter standing at the kitchen table. Then she read her mother's letter sitting down. Her mother had written in the looping schoolgirl hand Della remembered from her childhood that she had been wrong. She had been wrong about Richard Whitmore, and she had been wrong about the rumors, and she had been wrong about what she had asked of her only daughter in the matter of the broken engagement. She had let her fear of Boston society make her into a coward when her child needed a mother, and she had spent every day since Della left for Colorado understanding that more clearly. She did not ask for forgiveness because she did not believe she deserved it, but she had left her daughter the small sum of money that had been her own personal inheritance from her grandmother, free and clear of Della's father's estate, and she hoped Della would use it to build the life she had been brave enough to go west to find. The sum was $800. It was enough to rebuild the barn. It was enough to buy 10 more head of cattle. It was enough to send Tobias Ashcombe to Denver to study medicine. It was enough, in short, to give the Ashcombe family the cushion they had not had for a generation. Della wept once for her mother that night in the back room of the cabin, quietly and not for very long. And then she dried her face and she came out into the kitchen and she put the letter on the table in front of Wyatt and his brothers, and she said, "We are going to use this, all of it, to build the life she was too afraid to give me." Wyatt covered her hand with his. "All right, Della." They were married in the small white church in Stonewater Bend on a Saturday morning in the second week of November. The whole town came. Adelaide Thornberry rode up from Denver to stand as a witness. Sheriff Hollis Drennan stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hand and his old eyes wet. Della wore her grandmother's pearls at her throat and a simple ivory dress that the widow Bramwell, who kept the small boarding house at the edge of Stonewater Bend, had altered for her in 3 days flat, and her hair was pinned up with white wildflowers that Tobias had gathered from the last sheltered meadow on the south slope of Ashcombe Peak. Beckett stood as Wyatt's witness, and Tobias, with his eyes shining, walked Della down the short aisle in the place where her own father should have been. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married to this man, Tobias Ashcombe said clearly, "Her family does. Both her family in Boston and her family in this church and her family in the ground on the hill above Ashcombe Hollow." The preacher had to take a moment before he could go on. When the vows were said and the rings were exchanged and Wyatt bent down to kiss his wife, the whole church rose to its feet and applauded. And outside the open door of the church, the first snow of November had begun to fall, in soft, slow flakes, the way the snow had fallen on the night Wyatt asked her to marry him beside his brother's grave. They went home to Ashcombe Hollow that evening as husband and wife, and the door of the cabin closed behind them, and the lantern in the kitchen burned low, and in the morning a new life began in that hollow that would last for the next 30 years. The seasons turned. Spring came late, but it came, and Della and Wyatt planted the first true vegetable garden Ashcombe Hollow had ever known, and Beckett rebuilt the east wall of the barn from new cedar. He and Tobias had cut and milled themselves, and Tobias kissed Della on the forehead one bright April morning and rode out of the hollow with a satchel of books on his saddle and Adelaide Thornberry's letter of introduction to a respected physician in Denver in his pocket. The cabin felt smaller without him in it, but it was the right kind of smaller. The first child came in the late autumn of 1880. A boy. Wyatt held him in his great calloused hands the morning after the birth and looked down at the small, red-wrinkled face of his son and could not speak for several minutes. And Della watched her husband from the bed and understood in that moment more than any other that the man she had married had been waiting his whole life for this without knowing it. They named the boy Elias Wyatt Ashcombe after the brother in the ground on the hill, and the day they baptized him in the small white church in Stonewater Bend, the whole town came again. In the summer of 1885, Tobias Ashcombe rode back into the hollow with a medical degree from a school in Denver in a small leather bag of instruments and a quiet confidence in his amber eyes that had not been there when he left. He opened the first doctor's office Stonewater Bend had ever had in a small rented room above the saddlery, and within a year he was the most trusted man in 3 counties. In the winter of 1888, after 3 full years of patient and almost embarrassed courtship, Beckett Ashcombe finally asked the school teacher, Miss Prudence Eastlake, to be his wife, and she said yes before he had finished the question. They were married in the same small white church where Wyatt and Della had been married, and they built a second cabin a quarter-mile up the hollow from the main house. And their first child was a girl born on a snowy night in February, with Tobias attending the birth and Della holding Prudence's hand. The children of Ashcombe Hollow grew up the way mountain children grow up, with strong legs and steady hands, and a deep, ingrained understanding that the land they walked on had been bought with the blood and patience of the people who came before them. There were 4 of Wyatt and Della's children in the end: Elias Wyatt, born in 1880, Sarah Jane, born in 1883, who would grow up to be a school teacher in Denver, Daniel Tobias, born in 1886, who would stay on the land and run the cattle alongside his father, and little Lily Mae, born in the spring of 1890, who would grow up to marry one of Tobias's medical students and bring him home to help her uncle run the doctor's office in Stonewater Bend. The mining claim Elias had died for paid out steadily and never very richly, but enough. Always enough. Enough to keep the cattle going through the hard winters. Enough to put real glass in every window of the new 3-story house Wyatt built with his own hands and the help of his brothers in the year 1893, on the same spot where the original cabin had stood, with a stone well and a flower garden and 2 wooden rocking chairs on the porch, exactly the way his brother Elias had once drawn it on a folded sheet of butcher paper. Vernon Crowe, who was Samuel Brackett, was hanged in Philadelphia in the spring of 1880 for the murder of John Halloran. Wyatt did not travel east for the execution. He did not need to. The marshal sent word by letter when the sentence was carried out, and Wyatt read the letter once and folded it and put it in the small tin box where he kept the original telegram from Boston, in the journal of his brother Elias, in the silver button with the letter C. And he closed the lid of the box, and he never opened it again. The years went on. Della Ashcombe became by slow degrees the woman she had always been underneath the navy blue traveling gown of her arrival. Her honey hair turned slowly silver at the temples. The small, thin scar above her eyebrow faded almost away. She learned to ride a horse the way a frontier woman rides a horse, and she learned the names of every bird and every wildflower in Ashcombe Hollow, and she taught her children to read by candlelight, and in the long winter evenings, out of the same worn copy of Walden, she had read aloud to their father in the small back room of the original cabin in the autumn of 1879. Wyatt Ashcombe became, by the same slow degrees, a man who laughed. It happened gradually. He had not laughed in any honest way in the year before Della arrived, and he barely laughed in the first year of their marriage. And then one day in the early spring of 1881, his infant son grabbed at his beard with both small hands and pulled, and Wyatt threw back his head and laughed the way his brother Elias had once laughed, full and open and unguarded, and Della stopped what she was doing in the kitchen and stood very still for a long moment, because she had never heard that sound from her husband before, and she understood that something in him that had been broken since he was 12 years old had finally healed. He laughed often after that day. Not loud, never loud, but often. The years rolled forward like the seasons. Tobias never married. He had loved a woman briefly in Denver during his medical training, and the loving had not gone the way he had hoped, and he had come home to Stonewater Bend and put his energy into being the doctor of a frontier town instead. And he was the kind of bachelor uncle that every child in the hollow adored. He delivered every Ashcombe child after Elias Wyatt with his own hands, including all 3 of Beckett and Prudence's children, and he was never heard to complain about being alone. And Della in private thought he was the happiest of the 3 brothers, and she never said so out loud because it would have embarrassed him. Beckett mellowed. The fire in him did not go out, but it banked itself slowly into something steadier and warmer. He and Prudimans raised 3 children of their own and worked the cattle and the hay together, and he learned after about 10 years to laugh almost as often as Wyatt did. Almost. Della would sometimes catch him in the dooryard at sundown, standing alone with his hand on the corral rail, looking up at the hill where Elias was buried, and she knew without asking what he was thinking, and she would walk past him without speaking and lay her hand briefly on his shoulder, and he would put his own large hand over hers for a moment, and that was all that ever needed to be said between them about it. It was a good life. It was a hard life and an honest life, and it was a good life. In the autumn of 1909, 30 years after a small woman in a Navy traveling gown had stepped down off the morning train at the Stonewater Bend Depot, Wyatt and Della Ashcombe stood together on the porch of the 3-story house Wyatt had built with his own hands, and they watched their 2 grandchildren and Beckett's brood of small ones chase each other through the wildflowers in the dooryard. Wyatt was 61 years old. His chestnut hair had gone iron gray at the temples and white at the crown, and he walked with a slight, permanent limp from the old wound in his calf that Della had stitched on a bench at a mining camp on a snowy afternoon in his 32nd year. Della was 52. She had silver in her honey hair and laugh lines at the corners of her clear blue eyes and the same proud, quiet lift of her chin that she had carried off the train in 1879. Their oldest son, Elias Wyatt, was 28 years old now, and he was married, and his own 2 small children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 2, were chasing Beckett and Prudence's youngest grandchildren through the dooryard. Sarah Jane was 26 and teaching in Denver and engaged to be married in the spring. Daniel Tobias, 23, was sitting on the porch step at his father's feet, whittling a piece of pine into the rough shape of a horse for his nephew. Lily Maid, 19, was inside the house helping her Aunt Prudence set the table for the family supper that all of them, every Ashcombe within 50 miles, came back to the main house for on the first Sunday of every month. Beckett, 59 years old and still nearly as tall and broad-shouldered as he had been at 29, was leaning on the porch rail beside his older brother with a cup of coffee in his hand. Tobias, 57, the country doctor, had ridden up from Stonewater Bend that morning, the way he did every Sunday, and was now sitting in one of the wooden rocking chairs Wyatt had carved with his grandniece on his lap. The sun was sliding down toward the western shoulder of Ashcombe Peak. Wyatt put his arm around his wife's waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Della. Yes, Wyatt. Do you ever regret it, not going back to Boston, staying on this mountain with 3 rough men you did not know? She was quiet for a moment, the way she was always quiet when she was about to say something true. Wyatt Ashcombe, I came west to find a marriage. I found a family. I came west to find a roof over my head. I found a home. I came west because I had nowhere else to go, and I found somewhere along the way a place where I was not just allowed to be but needed to be. She turned her face up to his. I was born again the day I stepped down off that train, and I have known it every single day since. He bent down and kissed the top of her silver-streaked hair. On the hill behind the house in the long, golden light of the late afternoon, the small grave of Elias Ashcombe was visible to anyone who knew where to look. Fresh wildflowers lay on it. They had been placed there that morning by the same hand that had placed wildflowers there every single week for 30 years in summer, when the meadow was full of them, and in winter, when Della had to bring dried ones from the basket she kept on the kitchen mantelpiece for that exact purpose. Beside the grave of Elias was a second smaller barn that had not been there in 1879. It was the grave of the brother's father, whose body Wyatt and Beckett had moved up from the old family burial plot in the lower valley in the spring of 1899, after Wyatt had finally found it in himself to forgive the man who had once told him he would never amount to anything. The 2 graves lay side by side now, father and son, under the same pine markers that Wyatt himself had carved with his own hands. Wyatt looked at the hill. He looked at the grandchildren laughing in the dooryard. He looked at his wife. You are home now, Della, he said quietly. The words were the same words he had said to her on the porch of the original cabin in the September dusk of 1879. He had said them to her many hundreds of times in the years between, in winter and in summer and in bowing and in grief, and on the night each of their children had been born. He said them now one more time. You always were. She smiled the slow, quiet smile he had been seeing on her face for 30 years, the smile that had always been the answer to every question he had ever needed answered. The wind moved gently in the high pines above the hollow. The grandchildren chased each other through the wildflowers. The sun went down behind Ashcombe Peak in a long, slow flood of red gold light. And on the porch of the three-story house that a mountain man and a woman from Boston had built together with their own hands out of a telegram, in a journal under a floorboard, in a string of grandmother's pearls, in a wounded leg, in a burned barn, in a federal warrant, in 30 years of patient, ordinary love. Wyatt and Della Ashcombe stood together and watched their life unfold around them in the last good light of an October day, and neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left in either of them that needed saying. Winter was coming on, the way winter always comes on in the high country of Colorado. But winter always ends in these mountains, and love built with your own hands lasts longer than any winter in this world.